Hello. Welcome to NightSleep Whisper. I'm so glad you're here to share the night with me. Before we begin our journey, I want you to take a deep breath. Let the tension leave your shoulders. Find your most comfortable position, and let the world outside fade away. Tonight, we are stepping into the misty streets of Stonebridge, a 50-chapter mystery of secrets, shadows, and the search for truth. Close your eyes, listen to my voice, and let the mystery carry you into a deep, peaceful sleep. Let's begin. Mark drove his small blue car along the narrow road. The sun was slowly going down behind the green hills. The sky was a mix of orange and dark grey. He looked at the paper map on the seat next to him. He was very close to the village of Stonebridge. Mark was a journalist from a big city. He was 35 years old and had a passion for investigation. He liked his job, but he was tired of the busy city life. He wanted a great story for his newspaper, and he hoped to find it here. Stonebridge was a very quiet and old place. There were many stone houses with small windows and tall, dark trees. The air felt cold on his face when he opened the car window. He did not see many people on the streets. He saw a man in a thick coat walking a dog, and a woman carrying a large bag of bread near a shop. There were no children playing. Everything felt very still and heavy. Mark was there to meet a man named Thomas Gray. Thomas was a very famous writer. He wrote many popular books about mysteries and crimes. Millions of people read his stories. But Thomas was a private person. He did not like to talk to journalists or go to parties. He lived alone in a large house on the edge of the village. Mark was very lucky because Thomas finally agreed to an interview. Mark wanted to ask him about his new book. Mark parked his car near the old village square. He checked his silver watch. It was exactly 5 o'clock in the afternoon. He was on time. He took his notebook and his black pen from his leather bag. He also took a small camera. He locked his car and started to walk toward the north side of the village. The air smelled like wet grass and wood smoke from the chimneys. The road to Thomas's house was steep and narrow. There were large, thick bushes on both sides of the path. Mark heard the dry leaves moving under his heavy shoes. The wind moved the branches of the tall trees above him. A cold breeze blew through his jacket, and he pulled it closer to his body. He felt a little nervous, but he was also very excited. This interview was a big opportunity for his career. Finally, he saw the house at the end of the road. It was a tall, two-story building with white walls and a dark roof. It looked very old and grand. However, Mark noticed something strange. There were no lights in any of the windows. The garden was full of long, yellow grass and dark shadows. Mark walked to the front gate. The gate was made of heavy iron. It was not locked. It was slightly open. Mark pushed the gate, and it made a long, high noise. He walked up the stone path to the front door. He felt that something was wrong. He reached the heavy wooden door and prepared to knock. Mark stood in front of the heavy wooden door. He raised his hand and hit the wood 3 times. The sound was loud in the quiet evening. He waited for a few moments, but no one came to the door. He looked at his watch again. It was 10 minutes past 5. Thomas Gray was a professional man. He was always on time for his meetings. Mark felt a small knot of worry in his stomach. He knocked again, harder this time. Still, there was no answer from inside the house. He looked around the porch. There were several old newspapers on the ground. They were wet from the rain. This was strange. A famous writer like Thomas Gray usually kept his house very clean. Mark decided to try the door handle. He did not think it would open, but he was wrong. The handle turned easily in his hand. The door was not locked. Mark pushed the door slowly. It moved back with a long, high-pitched noise that echoed through the empty hallway. "Hello, Mr. Gray," Mark called out. His voice sounded thin and nervous. He stepped inside the house. The air inside was very cold. It felt colder than the air outside. There was a faint smell of old books and dried lavender. The hallway was long and dark. There were many paintings of old landscapes on the walls. Mark looked for a light switch. He found one near the door and pressed it. A small lamp on a side table turned on. The light was yellow and dim. Mark walked further into the house. He reached the living room. It was a large room with 2 big leather chairs and a fireplace. The fireplace was cold. There were no logs burning. On a small wooden table next to one of the chairs, Mark saw a white cup. He walked over and touched the cup. The tea inside was cold. There was a thin layer of dust on the surface of the liquid. This meant the cup was there for a long time. "Mr. Gray, are you here?" "It is Mark Thorne from the newspaper," he said again. He walked to the window and looked out at the garden. The sky was almost black now. The trees looked like tall ghosts in the dark. Mark felt like someone was watching him. But the room was empty. He was alone in the house. He looked at the floor and saw a trail of mud. The mud was dry and brown. It started at the front door and went toward the back of the house. Mark followed the mud trail. It led him to a small room at the end of the hallway. This was the study. Mark knew from pictures that this was where Thomas Gray wrote his famous stories. The door to the study was wide open. Mark walked inside and saw a large, dark desk near the window. There was a typewriter on the desk and many papers. But the chair was empty. The writer was gone. Mark looked at the desk and felt a chill. Something was definitely wrong in the village of Stonebridge. Mark stood in the middle of the study. His heart was beating fast. The room was very quiet. But it did not feel peaceful. It felt like a place where something bad happened. He walked slowly toward the large desk. The desk was made of heavy, dark wood. It was covered with books, pens, and many sheets of white paper. In the center of the desk sat a black typewriter. It looked old but very well kept. Mark looked down at the floor near the desk. He saw something shiny on the rug. He bent down to look closer. It was a glass. The glass was broken into many small, sharp pieces. They looked like ice under the dim light of the lamp. A small puddle of water was drying on the floor. It seemed like someone dropped the glass suddenly. Perhaps they were surprised or scared. Mark did not touch the glass. He knew he should be careful. He was a journalist, not a police officer, but he knew that evidence was important. He turned his attention back to the desk. He noticed a single piece of paper. It was not in the typewriter. It was lying flat on the wood. There was writing on it. The handwriting was messy and fast. It looked like the writer was in a great hurry. Mark leaned forward to read the words. The letter started with a name. Arthur. Mark did not know an Arthur in this village. He continued to read. The letter said, "I found the truth about the mill. It was not an accident. I have the names now. They are watching the house. If I go missing, look under the..." The sentence stopped there. There was a long ink line across the paper. It looked like the pen slipped from the writer's hand. Mark felt a cold shiver go down his back. This was not a normal disappearance. Thomas Gray was in danger because of something he discovered. He was writing a story about a real event, and someone wanted to stop him. Mark looked around the room again. He looked for a safe or a hidden box. He checked the bookshelves. There were hundreds of books about history, law, and crime. He pulled a few books from the shelf, but he found nothing behind them. He checked the drawers of the desk. They were full of stamps, envelopes, and extra ribbons for the typewriter. In the bottom drawer, he found a small photograph. It was a black and white picture of a group of men. They were standing in front of a large building. The building looked like a factory or a mill. The men were not smiling. One of the men was young. and he looked a little like the photos Mark saw of Thomas Gray from 20 years ago. Mark put the photograph in his pocket. He decided he could not stay in the house alone. It was dark, and he did not have a weapon. He needed to talk to the people in the village. He needed to find out who Arthur was and what happened at the mill. He walked out of the study and closed the door softly. He left the house and walked back to the iron gate. The village of Stonebridge was now completely dark. Mark walked back down the steep hill toward the center of the village. The street lamps were far apart, and they cast long, orange shadows on the stone road. The air was now very cold, and he could see his breath in the light. He felt a little hungry because he did not eat dinner. Most of the buildings were dark, but he saw a warm, yellow light coming from a shop at the corner of the square. A sign above the door said Sarah's Bread and Cakes. He walked toward the shop. He could smell the sweet scent of sugar and warm bread from the street. It was a pleasant smell, and it made him feel a little better. He pushed the door open. Inside, the shop was small and very clean. There were wooden shelves filled with loaves of bread, cookies, and large cakes. A woman was standing behind the counter. She was cleaning the wooden surface with a white cloth. She looked about 45 years old. She had kind eyes, but she looked very tired. She wore a blue apron over a thick grey sweater. She looked up and smiled at Mark, but the smile did not reach her eyes. She looked a little worried. "Good evening," the woman said. "I am Sarah. Can I help you? I am closing the shop soon." "Hello," Mark replied. "My name is Mark. I am a journalist. I am looking for Thomas Gray. I had a meeting with him, but he is not at his house." The door was open, and the house was empty. Sarah stopped cleaning the counter. Her face went pale, and she gripped the cloth tightly in her hands. She looked toward the window and then back at Mark. She stepped closer to the counter and lowered her voice. "You went to the big house?" she asked. "Mr. Gray is a good man. He comes here every morning to buy a small loaf of brown bread. But yesterday, he was different. He was very nervous. He did not even buy his bread." Mark took out his notebook. "What do you mean by different?" he asked. He kept looking out of the window. Sarah explained. "He looked at every car that drove past the shop. His hands were shaking when he reached for his wallet. He asked me if I saw any strangers in the village lately. I told him no. Only the usual people. Then, he left very quickly. He did not say goodbye. It was very strange for him. He is usually a very polite man." Mark listened carefully. Did he mention a man named Arthur? Or a fire at the old mill? Sarah's eyes went wide. She looked around the shop as if she wanted to make sure they were alone. She shook her head quickly. "I do not know about any Arthur. And the mill? We do not talk about the mill in Stonebridge. That was a long time ago. It was a very sad time for this village." She turned away and started to put some bread into a basket. Mark could see that she was uncomfortable. She did not want to talk more about the past. He thanked her for her help and bought a small piece of cake. As he left the shop, Sarah called out to him. "Be careful, Mr. Thorne," she said. "Stonebridge is a quiet place, but it has many secrets. Sometimes, it is better not to know the truth." Mark walked across the village square. The wind was stronger now, and it moved the empty wooden swings in the small park. He looked for a place to stay for the night. He saw a large sign hanging from a tall stone building. The sign showed a picture of a bridge made of grey stones. The words on the sign said, "The Stonebridge Inn." It was the only hotel in the village. Mark pushed the heavy front door and went inside. The air inside the inn was warm and thick with the smell of old wood and soup. The ceiling was very low, and the floor was made of dark wooden planks. There was a small reception desk in the corner. Behind the desk stood a tall man with short grey hair and very sharp blue eyes. He wore a white shirt and a black vest. This was Mr. Henderson, the owner of the inn. "Good evening," Mark said. "I need a room for the night." Mr. Henderson looked at Mark for a long time. He did not smile. He opened a large, heavy book on the desk and turned the pages. "A room for one person?" he asked. His voice was deep and very serious. "Yes, just for me," Mark replied. He took out his wallet. "I am a journalist from the city. I am here to see Thomas Gray, but I cannot find him." When Mark mentioned Thomas Gray, Mr. Henderson stopped writing. He looked up at Mark again. His eyes were cold. "Mr. Gray is a very private man," Henderson said. "He does not like visitors. The people of Stonebridge respect his privacy. Perhaps you should go back to the city." Mark felt uncomfortable, but he did not leave. "I have an appointment with him," Mark explained. "But his house is empty and the door is open. I am worried about him. Do you know where he might be?" Mr. Henderson closed the book. "I do not know the business of my neighbors," he said shortly. "I only run this inn. People come and people go. That is all." He took a heavy brass key from a hook on the wall. The key had the number 4 on it. He pushed the key across the desk toward Mark. "Room 4 is on the 2nd floor. It is at the end of the hallway. Breakfast is at 8 o'clock. Do not be late." Mark took the key. It felt cold in his hand. "Thank you," he said. He wanted to ask more questions, but Mr. Henderson turned away and started to clean a glass with a white cloth. It was clear that the conversation was over. Mark carried his bag up the narrow wooden stairs. The stairs made a soft noise under his feet with every step. The hallway was dark, and there were no pictures on the walls. He found room 4 and opened the door. The room was small but clean. There was a bed, a small table, and one window. Mark went to the window and looked out. He could see the dark shapes of the trees and the distant light from the bakery. He felt very alone in this strange village. He sat on the bed and looked at the silver key he found in the garden earlier. He knew Mr. Henderson was hiding something. Mark woke up early the next morning. The sun was not bright. A thick, white fog covered the village of Stonebridge. He could not see the trees or the road from his window. He felt tired because he did not sleep well. He kept thinking about the empty house and the messy letter on the desk. He washed his face with cold water and went downstairs for breakfast. The dining room of the inn was small. Mr. Henderson was there, putting plates of eggs and bread on the tables. In the corner, a man in a dark blue uniform was sitting alone. He was drinking a cup of black coffee. He had a stern face and very short hair. This was Officer Miller, the village policeman. Mark sat at a table near the window. He ate some bread, but he was not very hungry. He watched Officer Miller. He decided to speak to him. He stood up and walked over to the officer's table. "Good morning, officer," Mark said politely. "My name is Mark Thorne. I am a journalist. I am here to see Thomas Gray, the writer." Officer Miller did not look up from his coffee. He took a slow sip and then looked at Mark. His eyes were hard. "I heard about you," Miller said. "Mr. Henderson told me a journalist arrived last night. Why are you talking to me?" "I went to Mr. Gray's house yesterday," Mark explained. "The door was open. The house was empty. I found a broken glass and a strange letter on his desk. I think something is wrong. I think Mr. Gray is missing." Officer Miller put his cup down on the table. "Listen to me, Mr. Thorne," Miller said. His voice was low and serious. "Thomas Gray is an eccentric man. He often goes away for a few days without telling anyone. He likes to walk in the woods to find ideas for his books. It is not a crime to leave your front door open in a quiet village like this. But the letter mentioned a fire and names. Mark said. It looked like he was in a hurry. He looked scared when he was at the bakery, too. Officer Miller stood up. He was much taller than Mark. He leaned forward and looked into Mark's eyes. The police deal with crimes. Mr. Thorne. We do not deal with the imagination of journalists or the stories of writers. You are a stranger here. You do not know our village. My advice to you is simple. Go back to the city. We do not want trouble here. I'm just doing my job. Mark replied. He felt a little angry. Your job is in the city. Miller said. The investigation of any disappearance is my job. Stay away from the grey house. If I see you there again, I will arrest you for trespassing. Do you understand? Officer Miller put on his hat and walked out of the inn. He did not look back. Mark sat back down at his table. He felt a cold chill. Officer Miller did not want to find Thomas Gray. He wanted Mark to leave. This made Mark even more curious. He knew he could not stop now. The day passed very slowly for Mark. He spent most of the afternoon sitting in the village square. He watched the people of Stonebridge. They were quiet and did not talk to him. Every time he looked at someone, they looked away. He felt like an outsider. He saw Officer Miller's police car drive past several times. Mark stayed away from Thomas Gray's house during the day. He did not want to be arrested. When night fell, the village became even more silent. The thick fog from the morning was gone, but the air was very cold. Mark waited in his room at the inn until 10 o'clock. He heard the heavy footsteps of Mr. Henderson in the hallway as he turned off the lights. Mark waited for another 30 minutes. Then, he put on his dark coat and moved quietly to the door. He did not use the main stairs. He used a small back door that led to the alley behind the inn. He walked quickly through the shadows. He avoided the street lamps and stayed close to the stone walls. He did not want Officer Miller to see him. He took a long path through the fields to reach Thomas's house. The tall grass was wet, and it soaked his shoes. Finally, he reached the edge of the writer's property. He hid behind a large, old oak tree and looked at the house. The house was dark and silent, just like before. But then, Mark saw something. A small, bright beam of light was moving in the back garden. It was a flashlight. Someone was there. Mark held his breath and stayed very still. The person with the flashlight was moving slowly near the bushes. The light moved across the yellow grass and the old flower beds. Mark watched carefully. The person was wearing a long, dark coat with a hood. He could not see their face. The figure stopped near a large, flat rock under a willow tree. They bent down and moved the light over the ground. Mark heard the description of a metal tool hitting the earth. It was a rhythmic, scraping noise. The person was digging. Mark wanted to go closer, but he was afraid. If the person saw him, they might run away or attack him. He stayed behind the tree and watched for several minutes. The person stopped digging and reached down into the small hole. They pulled something out, but Mark could not see what it was. The figure put the object into a pocket and stood up. The flashlight turned off suddenly. The garden was dark again. Mark heard the description of heavy boots walking away toward the back of the property. He waited for a long time in the cold silence. His hands were shaking from the chill and the excitement. He knew he had to see what was under that rock. He waited until he was sure the stranger was gone. Then, he moved slowly toward the willow tree. Mark waited for a few more minutes behind the large oak tree. His heart was still beating very fast. He looked at the house and then at the back of the property. Everything was silent again. The person in the dark coat was gone. Mark moved slowly and carefully toward the willow tree. He tried to walk on the grass so his boots would not make a loud noise on the stone path. The willow tree was very large. Its long branches hung down like a curtain of hair. Mark pushed the branches aside and stepped into the space under the tree. It was very dark there. He took a small flashlight from his pocket but did not turn it on yet. He did not want anyone to see the light. He knelt on the cold, wet ground. The air smelled of fresh dirt and damp leaves. He saw the spot where the person was digging. The dirt was dark and messy. There was a large, flat rock near the base of the tree. The mysterious person moved the rock and took something, but they did not put the rock back correctly. Mark felt the ground with his hands. His fingers were cold, and the mud was sticky. He felt something hard and cold near the edge of the hole. He turned on his flashlight for just a second. The light was small, but it was enough. There, half hidden in the loose dirt, was a small object. Mark picked it up and wiped the mud away with his sleeve. It was a small, silver key. It was very beautiful and looked quite old. It had a small flower design on the top. Mark felt a surge of excitement. The stranger took one thing, but they missed this key. Mark held the key tightly in his hand. What did it open? He thought about the study and the desk. He thought about the package and the names on the list. This key was a piece of the puzzle. It was a physical link to Thomas Gray's secret. He put the key safely in his inner pocket and zipped it shut. He felt like he had a secret of his own now. Suddenly, he heard the description of a car engine in the distance. The sound grew louder as the car came closer to the house. Mark turned off his flashlight immediately. He stayed very low to the ground. He saw the bright headlights of a car moving along the road. The car slowed down near the gate of the house. Mark did not move. He was like a statue under the willow tree. The car did not stop. It continued down the road and the sound of the engine slowly faded away. Mark waited for another 5 minutes. He knew he could not stay here any longer. It was too dangerous. He stood up and checked the garden one last time. He walked quickly back toward the fields. He needed to get back to the inn and think. Tomorrow, he would find out what this silver key could open. Mark walked back to the village of Stonebridge. He stayed away from the main road and walked through the dark fields. The grass was wet and cold against his legs. He kept his hand on his pocket. He wanted to make sure the silver key was still there. He felt a mix of fear and excitement. He was not just a journalist anymore. He was part of the mystery. He reached the back of the Stonebridge Inn and looked around. No one was there. He moved toward the back door, but then he heard a soft voice from the shadows. "Mr. Thorne. Is that you?" Mark stopped immediately. His heart jumped. He looked toward a large stone wall near the alley. A woman stepped out from the darkness. She was tall and wore a long, brown coat and a warm scarf. She looked to be about 30 years old. Her face was pale, and she looked very nervous. Her eyes moved quickly, looking for anyone else in the street. "Who are you?" Mark asked. He kept his voice low. He was ready to run if he had to. "My name is Julia," the woman said. "I live in the small cottage near the lake. I saw you at the bakery today. I know you are looking for Thomas Gray." Mark stepped a little closer, but he was still careful. "How do you know that? And why are you following me in the middle of the night?" Julia sighed, and her breath made a small cloud in the cold air. "I am not following you to hurt you. I am here to help you. Thomas is a friend of mine. He told me that a journalist was coming from the city. He told me that if anything happened to him, I should find you." Mark was surprised. He knew something was going to happen. Julia nodded slowly. Thomas was not just writing a story. He was uncovering a secret that this village wanted to forget. He was very close to the truth. People here do not like the truth. They prefer the silence. What truth? Mark asked. Does it have something to do with the fire at the old mill? Julia looked around again. She seemed terrified. We cannot talk here. It is too open. Officer Miller or Mr. Henderson might see us. They are not what they seem. Mr. Thorne, you must be very careful about who you trust in Stonebridge. I found a key, Mark said. He did not know why he told her, but he felt she was telling the truth. Julia's eyes went wide. The silver key. Thomas told me about it. It opens something very important, but he did not tell me where that thing is. He said the information was in his notebook. I saw a letter on his desk. Mark said. It mentioned names. Do you know those names? I know some of them. Julia replied. But I have more information for you. Meet me tomorrow at the old bridge at noon. It is far from the village center. We can talk safely there. Please. Mr. Thorne, do not tell anyone you saw me. Before Mark could say another word, Julia turned and walked quickly away into the dark. She disappeared around the corner of a building. Mark stood alone in the alley. He felt the cold wind again. He had more questions now than before. He went inside the inn, climbed the stairs to his room, and locked the door. He held the silver key in his hand and stared at it until he finally fell asleep. Mark arrived at the old stone bridge exactly at noon. The sun was hidden behind thick, grey clouds. The bridge was very old and covered in green moss. Below the bridge, the river water was fast and dark. Mark stood in the center of the bridge and looked around. He did not see anyone. He felt a little cold, so he pulled his collar up. He looked at his watch. He hoped Julia would come. After a few minutes, he heard the dry grass moving near the trees. Julia appeared from the shadows of the forest. She looked tired and her face was very pale. She walked quickly toward him. She kept looking back at the road. She seemed afraid that someone was following her. You came, she said. She was breathing fast. Did you see anyone on your way here? No. Mark replied. I walked through the woods to stay hidden. I did not see any cars or people. They stood near the heavy stone wall of the bridge. The wind moved Julia's hair across her face. I must tell you the truth about Thomas's new book, she said. He told the village it was a story from his imagination. But that was a lie. He was writing a book about a real crime that happened in Stonebridge 20 years ago. Mark opened his notebook and held his pen ready. You mean the fire at the old mill? Julia nodded. Her eyes were full of sadness. Yes. For many years, everyone said the fire was an accident. They said the old machines were dangerous. But Thomas did not believe that. He spent months looking for old papers and talking to people in secret. He found proof that the fire was started on purpose. Why would someone burn the mill? Mark asked. For money. Julia whispered. The mill was losing money, but there was a large insurance policy. Also, a lot of money disappeared from the village office during the fire. It was a very clever plan. The fire destroyed all the evidence. Thomas found a list of names. He found the people who planned the fire and took the money. Mark thought about the messy letter he saw on Thomas's desk. Are those people still here in the village? Yes, Julia said. Her voice was shaking now. Some of them are very important people now. They have power and they have secrets. They do not want the world to know they are thieves and criminals. When Thomas started asking questions, they became very worried. He told me he had a secret notebook. He said all the names and all the proof were inside it. Do you know where the notebook is? Mark asked. No. Julia replied. But he said the silver key is the only way to find it. You must find that notebook. Mark. It is the only way to help Thomas. If the police from the city see that notebook, the people here cannot hide anymore. Suddenly, they heard a car engine on the road far away. Julia jumped. She looked terrified. I must go. It is not safe for us to be seen together. Wait. I have more questions. Mark called out. But Julia did not stop. She ran back into the tall trees and disappeared. Mark stood alone on the bridge. He looked at the silver key in his hand. He now understood that the empty desk was not just a mystery. It was a dangerous trap. Mark walked back toward Thomas Gray's house. The sun was going down, and the shadows were long and thin. He stayed close to the thick trees. He did not want anyone to see him on the main road. He knew Officer Miller was watching him. He reached the back of the property and looked at the house. It looked like a dark giant in the cold air. He found a small window near the kitchen. It was old and the wood was dry. He pushed it slowly. The window opened. Mark climbed into the house. It was very silent inside. He could only hear his own breathing. He walked through the kitchen and into the hallway. He went straight to the study. The study looked the same as yesterday. The typewriter was still on the desk. The broken glass was still on the floor. Mark took the silver key from his pocket. He looked around the room. He checked the desk drawers again, but he found nothing with a lock. He looked at the paintings on the wall. He even looked under the rug. Then, he remembered something Julia said. She said Thomas liked to hide things in plain sight. Mark went to the large bookshelf. There were hundreds of books. He looked for a book with a silver design or a special title. He saw a thick, green book. The title was The History of Silver. He pulled the book from the shelf. Behind the book, there was a small, dark hole in the wall. Inside the hole sat a small wooden box. The box was beautiful. It was made of dark wood with silver edges. Mark placed the box on the desk. His heart was beating very fast. He put the silver key into the small lock. He turned the key slowly. The lock opened. Mark lifted the lid. Inside the box, there was a single piece of paper. The paper was old and yellow at the edges. It was a list. At the top of the list, someone wrote in large letters, "The Mill Fire, 20 years ago." Under the title, there were 5 names. Mark read the names aloud. Mr. Henderson, Officer Miller, Dr. Aries, Arthur Vance, Samuel Reed. Mark felt a cold sweat on his forehead. These were the names of important people. He recognized the first 2 names immediately. Mr. Henderson ran the inn and Officer Miller was the policeman. They were the people who told him to leave the village. Now he knew why. They were part of a secret that was 20 years old. Suddenly, he heard the sound of heavy boots on the front porch. Someone was at the door. Mark quickly put the paper in his pocket. He put the box back in the wall and moved the green book to cover it. He had to hide. He did not want to be found inside the house. Mark stood very still in the dark study. The sound of the heavy boots on the porch stopped. He heard the front door handle turn. The door opened slowly. Mark looked around the room. There was no way to leave through the door. He saw a large, heavy curtain near the window. He moved quickly and hid behind the thick fabric. He held his breath. A man walked into the house. Mark could hear the floorboards making a soft, pressing noise under the man's weight. The footsteps were heavy and slow. They came closer to the study. Mark saw a sliver of light from a flashlight move across the floor. The light touched the desk and the empty typewriter. The person was looking for something. "I know you are here." A voice said. It was deep and cold. Mark recognized the voice. It was Mr. Henderson from the inn. Mark did not move. He felt his heart beating against his ribs. Mr. Henderson walked around the desk. He stayed in the room for a few minutes. He looked at the books and the drawers. Mark prayed that he did not see the hidden hole behind the green book. After a long time, the flashlight turned away. Mr. Henderson walked out of the study and toward the kitchen. Mark waited until the house was quiet again. He moved from behind the curtain and went to the small window he used to enter. He climbed out carefully and ran toward the trees. He did not stop until he was far away from the house. He sat on a fallen log and took the yellow paper from his pocket. He turned on his own small light to see it better. The 5 names were written in very neat ink. Mr. Henderson, Officer Miller, Dr. Aries, Arthur Vance, and Samuel Reed. Mark knew Henderson and Miller. But who were the others? Dr. Aries was likely the village doctor, but Arthur Vance and Samuel Reed were names he did not know. Beside each name, there was a number. The numbers looked like amounts of money. This was a list of people who took money from the mill fire. It was not just an accident. It was a crime for profit. Thomas Gray found this list, and that was why he was in trouble. Mark realized that most of the powerful people in Stonebridge were criminals. He could not go to the police because Officer Miller was on the list. He could not stay at the inn because Mr. Henderson was on the list. He felt a deep sense of danger. He was alone in a village where the law was part of the crime. He needed to find the other people on the list. He needed to find out who Arthur Vance was. He looked back at the dark village. The fog was starting to come back. Mark put the paper in his shoe. He thought it was the safest place. He decided to visit the village library the next morning. He needed to look at old records from 20 years ago. The next morning, the village was very quiet. The fog was gone, but the sky was still gray. Mark walked to the center of the village. He did not go back to the inn for breakfast. He did not want to see Mr. Henderson. He found the village library near the old stone church. The library was a small, square building made of dark stone. It had tall, narrow windows and a heavy green door. Mark pushed the door open. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of old paper and dust. There were many tall wooden shelves filled with thousands of books. A woman sat at a small desk near the entrance. She was about 60 years old. She had white hair and wore glasses on a gold chain. She was reading a large book. "Good morning," Mark said quietly. "My name is Mark. I am interested in the history of the village. Do you have old newspapers from 20 years ago?" The librarian looked up. Her eyes were sharp behind her glasses. "I am Mrs. Gable," she said. "We have the archives in the back room. Not many people ask about the past here. Why are you interested in 20 years ago?" Mark smiled as naturally as he could. "I am a writer. I am looking for information about the old industries of the area. I heard there was a large mill here." Mrs. Gable's face changed. She looked a little sad. "Ah, the mill. Yes, it was the heart of the village. But then the fire happened. It was a very dark time. Follow me." She led Mark to a small room at the back of the library. There were many large, flat drawers. She opened one and pulled out a stack of old newspapers. The paper was yellow and very thin. "These are the copies of the Stonebridge Gazette from that year," she said. "You can sit here and read. Please be very careful with them." Mark thanked her and waited for her to leave. When he was alone, he began to turn the pages. He looked for the month of the fire. He found it. The headline was large and black. "Tragedy at the Mill." Below the headline was a photo of the building in flames. Mark read the article carefully. He looked for the names on his list. He found Samuel Reed first. Samuel Reed was the owner of the mill. The article said he lost everything in the fire. Then he found Arthur Vance. Arthur Vance was the manager of the mill. The article said that Mr. Vance was lucky to be alive. He continued reading. He found a report about the cause of the fire. A man named Dr. Aries gave a statement to the police. He said that the fire was a terrible accident caused by a broken machine. Officer Miller, who was a young policeman then, signed the final report. Mark noticed something interesting. 2 weeks after the fire, Samuel Reed left the village. Arthur Vance also disappeared. No one saw them again. But Mr. Henderson, who was a worker at the mill, suddenly bought the old inn. Officer Miller became the head of the village police. They used the money to stay here. Mark thought, but where did the others go? He took a small photo of the article with his camera. He felt a cold hand of fear. The people on the list were not just friends. They were partners in a crime. He needed to find Dr. Aries. The doctor was the only one on the list who was still in the village besides the innkeeper and the policeman. Mark remained in the back room of the library. Mrs. Gable was busy at the front desk, and the library was very quiet. He looked at the old newspaper articles again. He was looking for more than just names. He wanted to understand the physical place where the crime happened. He looked through a dusty folder labeled Mill Construction and Layout. Inside the folder, he found a large piece of paper. It was a blueprint, a drawing of the mill structure from 30 years ago. The paper was fragile and smelled like old wood. Mark unfolded it carefully on the table. He saw the main floor where the machines were. He saw the office where Samuel Reed worked. Then, he noticed something strange at the bottom of the drawing. The drawing showed a small room under the main floor. It was a basement, but it was not under the whole building. It was a hidden space beneath the stone floor of the storage area. Mark looked back at the official police report from 20 years ago. The report said, the building was completely checked. There were no survivors and no items found in the ruins. Mark frowned. The police report did not mention a basement. Why? If Officer Miller signed that report, he was either lazy or he was lying. Mark believed he was lying. If the basement survived the fire, perhaps something was still inside it. Perhaps that was where the money was hidden, or where Thomas Gray was being kept. Mark took his pen and drew a small copy of the blueprint in his notebook. He marked the location of the hidden room. It was near the north wall of the mill, close to the river. He felt a sudden surge of energy. He had a location now. He didn't just have names. He had a destination. He closed the folders and walked back to the front desk. Mrs. Gable looked up from her book. Did you find what you were looking for, Mr. Thorne? She asked. Yes, thank you. Mark said. The history of this village is very interesting. I'm going to walk around and look at some of the old sites now. Be careful, Mrs. Gable warned. The area near the old mill is dangerous. The stones are loose, and the ground is not stable. No one goes there anymore. It is a lonely place. Mark thanked her and walked out into the cool air. He did not go back to the inn. He walked toward the edge of the village, following the sound of the river. He knew the ruins of the mill were about 2 miles away. He felt the silver key in his pocket. He hoped the key would fit a lock in that hidden basement. As he walked, he kept looking behind him. He felt like the eyes of the village were watching his every move. Mark walked away from the center of Stonebridge. He followed a narrow path that ran next to the river. The water was wide and dark, moving quickly over the cold stones. The further he walked, the quieter the world became. He could no longer hear the sounds of the village or see the smoke from the chimneys. The forest was thick here. The trees were tall and thin, with branches that reached out like long fingers. He walked for about 30 minutes. His legs felt tired, and the damp air made his skin feel cold. Then, through the trees, he saw it. The old mill stood on the edge of the river like a giant, broken ghost. It was a large building made of grey stone and heavy wood. Most of the roof was gone. The windows were empty holes that looked like dark eyes. Black marks from the Great Fire still covered the walls, even after 20 years. Mark stopped at the edge of the ruins. He felt a heavy sadness in the air. This place was once full of life and noise. Now, it was only a skeleton of stone and wood. He took his notebook out of his pocket and looked at the copy of the blueprint. He needed to find the north wall. According to the drawing, the hidden basement was located near the riverside of the building. He walked carefully into the ruins. The ground was covered in broken glass, pieces of wood, and thick green moss. Every time he stepped, he heard the crunch of debris under his boots. He reached the north wall. It was a tall, thick wall made of heavy stones. The river was just a few feet away, making a constant, rushing sound as the water hit the rocks. Mark looked at the floor. It was made of large, flat stones. Many of them were covered in dirt and old leaves. He began to move the leaves with his foot. He was looking for a seam in the floor, a sign of a hidden door or a trapdoor. He remembered the blueprint. The basement was supposed to be exactly here, under the storage area. As he worked, he noticed something caught on a sharp piece of wood near the wall. It was a small piece of blue cloth. Mark picked it up. The fabric was soft and clean. It was not 20 years old. It looked new. He remembered the photo he saw in Thomas's house. Thomas had a blue coat that was exactly this color. Mark felt a chill that was not from the wind. If the cloth was here, it meant Thomas Gray was here recently. He looked down at the heavy stones again. He was close. He knew the truth was right beneath his feet. He took the silver key from his pocket and held it tightly. He just needed to find the way down. Mark knelt on the cold stones of the mill floor. He held the small piece of blue cloth tightly in his hand. He was sure it belonged to Thomas Gray's favorite coat. He felt a mix of hope and fear. If Thomas was here at the mill, was he safe? Or was he a prisoner in the dark space below? Mark started to clear more leaves from the floor. He used a heavy, dry branch to scrape away the thick dirt and the dead grass. Suddenly, Mark stopped moving. He felt a strange sensation on the back of his neck. It was the uncomfortable feeling that someone was looking at him. He did not hear a specific sound, but the air felt different. He stayed very still, frozen in his position. He did not turn his head yet. He listened to the rushing river and the wind in the tall trees. Everything seemed normal, but his skin felt cold with a sudden chill. He slowly turned his head to the left. The forest around the mill was very thick and dark. The trees stood like tall, silent soldiers. He looked at the deep shadows between the trunks. At first, he saw nothing. Then, he saw a movement. It was about 50 feet away, behind a large pine tree. A dark shape moved quickly behind the thick trunk. It was the shape of a man. The man was tall and wore dark clothes. He did not move now. He was waiting. Mark's heart began to beat very loudly in his chest. He was alone in the empty ruins, and a stranger was watching him from the trees. Was it Officer Miller? Was it Mr. Henderson? Or was it the mysterious person he saw digging in the garden 2 nights ago? Mark felt like a mouse in a trap. Mark stood up slowly. He did not want to show the stranger that he was scared. He looked toward the pine tree. "Who is there?" he called out. His voice was a little shaky. The sound of his voice was quickly lost in the loud noise of the rushing river. There was no answer from the forest. The shadow did not move again. It was as if the man was part of the tree itself. Mark realized he was in a very dangerous position. The mill ruins had no doors to lock and no walls to hide behind. He was an easy target. He looked at the stone floor again. He needed to find the entrance to the basement quickly. He could no longer run back to the village easily because the stranger was standing near the main path. He had to stay inside the ruins. He moved toward the center of the old storage room. He looked for a lever or a special handle. He saw a large iron ring attached to a heavy stone in the corner. It was covered in orange rust. He grabbed the metal ring with both hands and pulled with all his strength. The stone did not move at first. He tried again, pulling harder. He felt the muscles in his arms and back tighten. Suddenly, he heard a new sound from the forest. It was the sharp noise of a heavy boot hitting a dry branch. The shadow was coming closer. Mark let go of the ring and looked for a place to hide. Mark moved quickly. He saw a large pile of old, grey wooden boards in the corner of the room. He ran to them and squeezed his body into the narrow space behind the wood. He sat on the cold ground and tried to breathe slowly. The air was full of old dust, but he stayed very still. He looked through a small hole between the boards. His heart felt like a drum in his chest. The stranger stepped into the room. He was a tall man with broad shoulders. He wore a long, dark coat and a black hat that covered his eyes. He walked with a heavy, steady step. He stopped right where Mark was kneeling just a minute ago. The stranger looked at the ground. He saw the dirt that Mark moved. He looked at the iron ring in the stone floor. The man did not say anything. He looked around the ruins with a sharp gaze. Mark felt like the man could see through the wooden boards. Then, the stranger reached into a deep pocket of his coat. He pulled out a long, heavy metal bar. He walked to the iron ring and pushed the bar through it. He used the bar as a lever to lift the heavy stone. Mark watched as the man pulled with great strength. The heavy stone floor finally moved. It made a long, grinding sound as it slid across the other stones. A dark, square hole appeared in the ground. A cold, damp smell of earth and rot came from the opening. It was the entrance to the hidden basement. The stranger stood at the edge of the dark hole. He took a small, powerful flashlight from his pocket. He shone the light into the darkness. "I know you can hear me, Thomas," the man said. His voice was deep and very cold. "The game is over. Give me the notebook and the money. If you do, I might let you see the sun again." Mark felt a wave of shock. Thomas was definitely down there. But who was this man? Was it Arthur Vance? Or was it Samuel Reed, the owner of the mill? The man did not wait for an answer. He put his flashlight in his mouth and gripped the top of a metal ladder that was fixed to the wall of the hole. He began to climb down, disappearing into the earth. Mark waited until the light from the man's flashlight was far below. He knew this was extremely dangerous. He was one man against a criminal. But he could not leave Thomas Gray alone in the dark. He crawled out from his hiding place and walked to the edge of the hole. The metal ladder looked old and rusty. He took a deep breath, gripped the cold metal, and started to climb down into the darkness. Mark did not stay in the dark basement for long. He saw the stranger's flashlight moving in the distance below. He heard the man's heavy boots and his cold, threatening voice. Mark realized he was not prepared to fight a dangerous criminal in the dark. He had no weapon and no plan. He needed more information before he could rescue Thomas Gray. He climbed back up the rusty metal ladder with great care. He reached the stone floor of the mill, slid the heavy trapdoor back into place, and ran into the forest. He walked back to the village under the light of the moon. The walk felt much longer this time. His mind was full of questions. Who was the man in the basement? Was it one of the men from the list? By the time he reached the Stonebridge Inn, it was very late. The village was completely silent. Mark went to his room and stayed awake for hours, looking at the names on his list. The next morning, Mark went down to the dining room. He was the only guest there. Mr. Henderson was behind the small bar, cleaning a glass with a dirty white cloth. He looked tired and his eyes were dark. Mark decided it was time to be direct. He did not want to hide anymore. He walked to the bar and stood in front of the innkeeper. "Mr. Henderson, I want to talk to you about the old mill," Mark said. His voice was firm. Mr. Henderson stopped cleaning the glass. He did not look up. "I told you before, Mr. Thorne. That is a sad story from the past. We do not talk about it here." "I think we should," Mark replied. He took the yellow paper from his pocket and placed it on the bar. "I found this list. Your name is at the top. It says you received $50,000 after the fire. Why did the mill worker suddenly have enough money to buy this in?" Mr. Henderson's face turned a deep, angry red. He dropped the glass, and it hit the floor. It did not break, but the sound was loud in the quiet room. He leaned over the bar and looked at Mark with pure hate in his eyes. His hands were shaking. "You are a very nosy man, Mr. Thorne," Henderson whispered. His voice was like a snake. "You come into our village and you think you can dig up the past. That fire was a tragedy. Many people lost their jobs. I worked hard for this inn. Then why is your name on a list of criminals?" Mark asked. "And where is Thomas Gray?" "I saw someone at the mill ruins last night. I know he is being kept in the hidden basement." Mr. Henderson reached across the bar and grabbed Mark by his coat. He pulled Mark closer until their faces were almost touching. "You listen to me," he growled. "You are playing a very dangerous game. This is not the city. In Stonebridge, things happen to people who ask too many questions. If you do not leave this village today, you will never leave at all." He pushed Mark away with great force. Mark hit a wooden chair and almost fell. Mr. Henderson pointed a thick finger at the door. "Get out of my inn. Now." Mark took the list from the bar and walked out of the room. He felt the heat of Henderson's anger behind him. He knew he was now a marked man. He had to find Julia. She was the only person who could help him now. Mark walked away from the Stonebridge Inn as fast as he could. His heart was beating very fast. He did not look back. He felt the angry eyes of Mr. Henderson on his back. He knew he could not stay at the inn anymore. He had his small bag with him, but he did not care about his other things. He needed to find Julia. She was his only friend in this cold and dangerous village. He remembered what Julia said. She lived in a small cottage near the lake. Mark walked toward the edge of the village. The road was dusty and quiet. He saw the lake in the distance. The water was gray and looked like lead under the cloudy sky. There were no boats on the water. It was a very lonely place. He found a narrow path that led to a small wooden house. The house was surrounded by tall grass and a few thin trees. This was Julia's cottage. It was a simple building with a small porch and 2 windows. Mark felt a little hope. Maybe Julia had more answers. Maybe she knew where Thomas was being taken. He reached the front door. "Julia," he called out softly. "It is Mark Thorne. I need to talk to you." There was no answer. The only sound was the wind moving the dry grass. Mark felt that familiar chill again. He pushed the door. It was not locked. He stepped inside the cottage. The room was small and dark. There was a wooden table, 2 chairs, and a small bed in the corner. Mark looked at the fireplace. There were black logs inside, but there was no fire. He touched the stones of the fireplace. They were very cold. This meant the fire was out for a long time. Julia was not there. Mark looked around the room. He saw a blue scarf on the floor. It was the scarf Julia wore when he met her at the bridge. The room was a mess. A chair was turned over on the floor. A small lamp was broken near the bed. It looked like someone was in a great hurry. Or perhaps there was a struggle. Mark picked up the scarf. It felt soft in his hand. He felt a deep sadness. Julia tried to help him, and now she was gone too. He saw a small piece of paper on the table. He picked it up. There was no writing on it, but there was a small purple stain. It smelled like grapes. Mark remembered seeing a bottle of grape juice at the bakery. Did Sarah the baker come here? Or was Julia trying to leave a sign? Mark stood in the middle of the empty cottage. He felt very small and very alone. Thomas Gray was missing. Julia was missing. The innkeeper and the policeman were criminals. He had the silver key and the list, but he did not know what to do next. He realized that the package everyone wanted was more than just a story. It was a secret that people were ready to kill for. Mark walked back to the village square. The sun was setting, and the light was a deep, angry orange. He knew he could not stay at the inn after the fight with Mr. Henderson, but he still had his luggage in room 4. He needed his clothes and his extra camera lenses. Most importantly, he needed to feel safe, but Stonebridge was not a safe place anymore. He approached the Stonebridge Inn from the back alley. He moved quietly, staying close to the cold stone walls. He looked through a small side window and saw Mr. Henderson in the kitchen. The innkeeper was talking to someone on the phone. He looked very serious. Mark waited until Henderson turned his back. Then, he slipped through the back door and moved quickly up the wooden stairs. The stairs made a soft, complaining sound under his weight, but he did not stop. He reached the second floor and entered room 4. The room was cold. He immediately saw that someone was there while he was away. His bag was open on the bed. His clothes were moved. Someone was looking for the list or the silver key. Mark checked his hidden pocket inside his jacket. The key and the paper were still there. He felt a small sense of relief. Then, he looked at the bed. On the white pillow, there was a small, square envelope. It was perfectly clean and white. Mark's hands shook as he picked it up. There was no name on the outside. He opened the envelope and pulled out a single piece of paper. The message was written in large, black letters. It was short and direct. It said, "Stop looking or you are next." Mark felt a wave of fear. The people in this village were watching his every move. They knew he was at the mill. They knew he was talking to Julia. He realized that Julia's disappearance was not an accident. She was taken because she talked to him. And now, they were coming for him. He quickly packed his remaining things into his bag. He didn't want to spend another minute in this room. He felt like the walls had ears and the windows had eyes. He looked out the window and saw Officer Miller's police car parked across the street. The officer was sitting inside, staring at the front door of the inn. Mark was trapped. He sat on the edge of the bed for a moment to think. He had two choices. He could give up and drive back to the city, or he could stay and find Thomas. If he left now, Thomas and Julia might never be found. He looked at the list of names again. Dr. Aries. The doctor was the only name left in the village that he had not visited. Mark decided he would not leave. He would find a way out of the inn without the officer seeing him. He had to be smarter than them. He took the note and put it in his pocket. He was scared, but he was also more determined than ever. The truth was close, and he was the only one who could find it. Mark sat in the dark room. He watched the headlights of Officer Miller's car through the window. He knew he could not leave through the front door. He grabbed his bag and moved to the small window at the back of the room. This window looked over the narrow alley. It was a long drop to the ground, but there was an old metal water pipe on the wall. He climbed out of the window. The cold air hit his face. He gripped the metal pipe with his hands. The metal was icy and slippery. He moved down slowly. The pipe made a low, scraping sound against the stone wall. Mark stopped for a second, but no one came. He reached the ground and ran into the shadows of the alley. He was finally away from the inn. He needed to find the people on the list. He knew Henderson and Miller were in the village. But what about the others? Samuel Reed and Arthur Vance were important. He remembered the village office near the square. It was a small building where all the records of the people were kept. Perhaps he could find their addresses there. The village office was closed. But Mark was lucky. The side gate was open. He walked to the back of the building. He saw a small window that was not locked. He pushed it open and climbed inside. The office was full of tall cabinets and dusty files. He took out his flashlight. He looked for the drawer with the letter R for Reed and V for Vance. He found the folder for Samuel Reed. He opened it and read the notes. Samuel Reed was the owner of the mill, but the record had a big red stamp on it. Left village. October 20 years ago. There was no new address. It was like he disappeared into thin air. Then, he looked for Arthur Vance. The manager of the mill had a similar record. Address unknown. Left village. November 20 years ago. Mark sat on the floor. Both the owner and the manager left Stonebridge right after the fire. They took the money and they never came back. This meant only 3 people from the list were still here. Mr. Henderson, Officer Miller, and Dr. Aries. The first 2 were already his enemies. That left only one person who might have the answers he needed. Dr. Aries was the person who signed the report about the accident. Mark looked at the village map on the wall of the office. He found the address for Dr. Aries. The doctor lived in a large house on the hill, far away from the other houses. It was a lonely place. Mark felt a sense of urgency. If the others were watching him, they would know he was looking for the doctor. He had to get there before they did. He climbed back out of the window and started the long walk up the hill. The hill was steep, and the path was rocky. Mark's legs felt heavy as he walked higher and higher. The air was very quiet here. He could see the whole village of Stonebridge below him. It looked small and peaceful, but Mark knew it was full of lies. He finally reached the house of Dr. Aries. It was a cold building with grey walls. There were no flowers in the garden, only dry bushes and sharp stones. Mark stood at the front door. He felt a little nervous. Dr. Aries was the man who signed the paper saying the mill fire was an accident 20 years ago. Mark reached out and knocked on the heavy wood. He waited in the dark. A few moments later, he heard the sound of a latch moving. The door opened just a few inches. An old man with a very wrinkled face looked out. He wore a heavy wool sweater and thick glasses that made his eyes look very large. "Yes." "Who is it?" the man asked. His voice was weak and thin. "My name is Mark Thorne. I am a journalist." Mark said. "Are you Dr. Aries?" The old man nodded slowly. "I am. But I do not see patients anymore. I am retired. It is very late for a visit. I am not here because I am sick." Mark explained. "I am here to talk about Thomas Gray. And I am here to talk about the mill fire from 20 years ago." Dr. Aries stayed very still. His eyes moved to Mark's bag and then back to his face. He looked like he wanted to close the door, but he did not. He looked very tired and a little bit sad. After a long silence, he stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in, Mr. Thorne. It is too cold to stand outside in the wind." Mark followed the doctor into a small, warm living room. There were many old medical books on the shelves and a soft orange light from a single lamp. Dr. Aries sat in a large green chair. He pointed to another chair for Mark. Mark did not sit down immediately. He took the yellow list from his pocket and held it out for the doctor to see. "I found this list in a hidden box at Thomas Gray's house," Mark said. "Your name is on it. Beside your name, it says $10,000. Why did you receive that money after the fire, Dr. Aries? Was it a gift, or was it a payment for a lie?" The doctor's hands began to shake. He looked at the paper for a long time. He did not look angry like Mr. Henderson. Instead, he looked very afraid. He put his head in his hands. "I was a young doctor then," he whispered. "I had no money, and I had many debts. They told me it was a simple thing. They told me the fire was going to happen anyway because the mill was failing. They said no one would get hurt." "Who told you this?" Mark asked. "Samuel Reed and Arthur Vance," Dr. Aries replied. "They planned everything. They told Miller and Henderson to help them. My job was to say the machines were old and broken. I lied on the official report. I have lived with that lie for 20 years, and it is a very heavy weight." Mark leaned forward. "Where is Thomas Gray now?" "I saw a man at the mill ruins. Was that Arthur Vance?" Dr. Aries looked at the dark window. "Vance returned to the village 3 days ago. He is a dangerous man, Mr. Thorne. They are keeping Thomas because he knows where the money is hidden. If you want to help him, you must be very fast. But you cannot go alone." Mark sat very still as Dr. Aries continued to speak. The room was warm, but Mark felt a coldness in his heart. The doctor's voice was low and sad. He looked at the orange flame of a small candle on the table. He began to describe the night of the fire 20 years ago. It was a story of greed and a terrible plan. Samuel Reed was the owner of the mill. Dr. Aries said he wanted to be a very rich man, but the mill was losing money every month. The machines were old, and the price of wood was low. He did not want to work hard to fix it. He wanted a fast way to get millions of dollars from the insurance company. Mark wrote everything in his notebook. "And Arthur Vance helped him?" "Yes," the doctor replied. "Vance was the manager. He was a clever man but very cruel. He was the one who bought the gasoline. They chose a night when the wind was strong. They knew the wind would make the fire grow quickly. They told the workers to leave early that day. But they needed the fire to look like an accident. That was where I came in." Dr. Aries cleaned his glasses with a shaky hand. "They came to me 2 days before the fire. They knew I had many bills I could not pay. They offered me $10,000. That was a lot of money back then. My job was simple. After the fire, I had to look at the ruins. I had to write a paper saying a small electrical spark started the fire. I had to say no one was responsible." "What about Officer Miller and Mr. Henderson?" Mark asked. "Miller was a young officer who wanted a promotion and a new car." Dr. Aries explained. "He took $30,000 to keep the fire trucks away for 20 minutes. By the time the trucks arrived, the building was already gone. Mr. Henderson was just a worker who saw them with the gasoline. He was not a bad man, but he was scared. They gave him $50,000 to buy the inn and keep his mouth shut forever." Mark felt a wave of anger. These men destroyed the town's history and lied to everyone for 20 years. And Thomas Gray found all of this out. "Thomas is a brilliant researcher," the doctor said. "He found the old bank records. He found the evidence that the money was not from the insurance, but from a secret safe inside the mill that was never reported. He had everything in his notebook. That is why they took him. Arthur Vance came back because he heard Thomas was close to the truth. Vance wants that notebook, and he will kill Thomas to get it." Dr. Aries looked at Mark with tears in his eyes. "I am old and I am dying. Mr. Thorne, I cannot carry this secret to my grave. You must find the notebook before Vance does. It is the only way to stop them." Mark stood up. He had the names. He had the story. Now, he had to go back to the mill ruins. He had to face Arthur Vance and save Thomas Gray. He thanked the doctor and walked out into the cold night. He knew that the people of Stonebridge were no longer just shadows. They were enemies. And the clock was ticking. Mark walked down the steep hill from Dr. Ariz's house. The wind was cold and pushed against his back. He felt a heavy weight in his pocket where the list and the silver key stayed. He knew the truth now. But the truth was dangerous. He reached the bottom of the hill and walked quickly toward the village square. He found his small blue car exactly where he left it. The windows were covered in a thin layer of frost. He jumped inside and started the engine. The heater began to blow warm air. But Mark still felt cold. He needed to find a safe place to think. He decided to drive toward the edge of the village, away from the inn and the police station. As he turned onto the main road, he looked into his rearview mirror. 2 bright lights appeared behind him. A large, black car was following him. It did not have a front license plate. Mark turned into a side street, but the black car turned too. Mark drove faster. He could feel his hands shaking on the steering wheel. He turned again, moving onto a narrow, winding road that led toward the old forest. The black car stayed exactly the same distance behind him. Mark pushed the gas pedal harder. His small car moved quickly over the bumpy road. The black car did not slow down. It moved closer. Now, Mark could see the dark shape of the driver. The person wore a hat and stayed very low in the seat. Mark realized this was not a warning. The person in the black car wanted to catch him. He reached a part of the road with many sharp turns. The trees on both sides were very close to the road. Mark looked for a place to hide his car, but the road was too narrow. Suddenly, the black car accelerated. It hit the back of Mark's car with a heavy, metallic sound. Mark's car shook violently. He struggled to keep the steering wheel straight. "They are trying to push me off the road," Mark whispered to himself. The black car hit him again, harder this time. Mark heard the sound of breaking plastic as his back light shattered. He looked ahead and saw a bridge. The bridge was narrow and made of old wood. He knew he could not stop. He had to lose the black car before he reached the deep water of the river. Mark saw a small, muddy path that led into the thick bushes. It was a risky move. At the last second, he turned the steering wheel sharply. His car jumped and bounced over the rocks and mud. He turned off his headlights immediately. He drove into the deep shadows of the trees and stopped the engine. He sat in total darkness, listening to the sound of his own fast breathing. A few seconds later, the black car drove past the path. The sound of its heavy engine faded into the distance. Mark waited for a long time. He did not move. He did not turn on the lights. He was safe for now, but he knew they were hunting him like an animal. He was no longer just a visitor. He was a target. Mark waited in the dark car for 20 minutes. The forest was very quiet. He only heard the wind moving the branches of the tall trees. He was sure the black car was gone. He turned on his engine and drove slowly back to the road. He did not go to the inn. Instead, he drove toward the old stone church on the other side of Stonebridge. Behind the church was the village cemetery. The cemetery was a very old place. It had a high stone wall and a heavy iron gate. Mark parked his car under a large tree and walked to the gate. It was not locked. He pushed it open. The cemetery was full of tall, grey stones. Some stones were broken. Others were covered in thick green ivy. Mark walked through the rows of graves. He held his flashlight low to the ground. He was looking for the dates. He wanted to see the graves from 20 years ago. He found a section near the back wall. The stones here were cleaner. He read the names carefully. Most people were old when they died. But then, he saw a large, white stone in the corner. The name on the stone was Elena Vance. Under the name, it said, "Beloved wife of Arthur Vance. Died October, 20 years ago." Mark felt a shock. Elena Vance died in the same month as the mill fire. Was she at the mill when the fire started? Dr. Aries said the plan was for no one to get hurt. If Arthur Vance's wife died in the fire, that changed everything. Perhaps that was why Arthur Vance was so angry and dangerous now. Maybe the fire was a mistake that killed the person he loved. Mark looked at the grave next to Elena's. It was a small stone with no name. It only had a date. October, 20 years ago. Mark felt a deep sadness in his chest. The secret of the fire was not just about stolen money. It was about people and lives that were lost. He realized that the mystery was much bigger than a simple crime. Suddenly, Mark heard a soft sound. It was the sound of a foot stepping on dry leaves. He turned off his flashlight immediately. He hid behind a large stone cross and stayed very still. He looked toward the entrance of the cemetery. A person was walking through the gate. The person was carrying a bunch of white flowers. Mark watched from the shadows. The person walked straight to Elena Vance's grave. They knelt down on the grass and placed the flowers near the stone. The person stayed there for a long time. Mark could not see their face in the dark, but he could hear a low, sad sound. It was the sound of someone crying softly into the wind. Mark waited. He did not want to move. He felt like he was watching a private moment. But he needed to know who this was. He took a small step forward to see better. A dry branch broke under his heavy boot. The person at the grave stopped crying. They stood up quickly and looked toward the shadows where Mark was hiding. The person at the grave froze. Mark's heart hammered against his ribs. He had revealed his position, and there was nowhere to run without being seen. The figure stood up slowly, the long dark coat swirling in the wind. The hat was pulled low, but the moonlight caught the sharp line of a jaw and a pair of eyes that burned with a mix of sorrow and fury. "Who is there?" the man demanded. His voice was the same deep, cold rasp Mark had heard in the mill ruins. It was Arthur Vance. Mark stepped out from behind the stone cross. He kept his hands visible, showing he was not carrying a weapon. "My name is Mark Thorne. I'm a journalist. I didn't mean to intrude on your privacy." Vance didn't move. He looked down at the fresh white flowers on Elena's grave, then back at Mark. "A journalist. A seeker of stories. You have no idea what kind of story you are stepping into, Mr. Thorne. This isn't a game of words. This is a matter of blood and ash." "I know about the fire, Mr. Vance," Mark said, his voice gaining strength. "I know it wasn't an accident. I know Elena died that night. Was that part of the plan? Or did Reed and the others betray you?" Vance's expression shifted. For a fleeting second, the cold mask of the criminal broke, revealing a man hollowed out by grief. The plan was simple. The mill was to be empty. But Elena, she went back for something. A locket. By the time I found her, the flames were too high. Reed and Miller, they didn't care. They got their money. They built their lives while mine turned to dust. "Then why are you hurting Thomas Gray?" Mark asked. "He's trying to tell the truth. He wants the same thing you should want. Justice for what happened to her." Vance took a step forward, and Mark instinctively stepped back. "Justice? There is no justice in Stonebridge. There is only survival." Thomas found the notebook that contains the real bank records. The ones that prove Samuel Reed didn't just take insurance money. He stole the pension funds of every worker in this village. That money is still out there, hidden. Thomas won't say where he put the final key. "He's at the mill," isn't he? In the basement. Mark pressed. Vance laughed. He was. But the village has many basements, Mr. Thorne. And Officer Miller is becoming impatient. If you want to help your friend, you have until dawn. After that, the accidents of 20 years ago will start happening all over again. Vance turned and walked toward the iron gate, his figure disappearing into the thick mist. Mark stood alone among the graves. He realized that the villains were now fighting among themselves. Vance wanted the money for revenge. Miller and Henderson wanted it to protect their power. And Thomas Gray was caught in the middle. Mark looked at the white flowers on the grave. He realized he had been thinking about the silver key as the only one. But Vance mentioned a final key. Mark reached into his pocket and felt the silver key. He noticed something he hadn't seen before, a small engraving on the side. SH. The schoolhouse. Mark whispered. He knew where he had to go. Mark didn't waste a second. He ran to his car and drove away from the cemetery. The clock on his dashboard showed 1:30 a.m. Dawn was only a few hours away. He drove through the winding streets of Stonebridge until he reached the edge of the residential area. There, standing tall against the dark sky, was the old Victorian schoolhouse. It had been closed for years, replaced by a newer building in the next town, but the structure remained as a silent monument to the past. The building was spooky. Its tall, pointed roof looked like a witch's hat, and the ivy-covered walls seemed to shiver in the wind. Mark parked his car a block away and approached on foot. He remembered what Julia had said. Thomas often spent time here, researching the village's genealogy. He tried the front doors. They were chained shut. He walked around the perimeter, his flashlight beam cutting through the thick fog. He found a basement window with a broken latch. He squeezed through, dropping onto a floor covered in old textbooks and dust. The air was dry and smelled of chalk and old paper. He made his way up to the main office. Every floorboard he stepped on seemed to scream in the silence. He reached the heavy wooden door labeled Principal's Office. In the corner of the room stood a tall, antique wooden cabinet with glass doors. Mark saw a small lock at the bottom, a lock with a flower design that matched the top of his silver key. His hands were trembling as he knelt. He inserted the silver key. It fit perfectly. The lock turned. Inside the cabinet was a stack of old school records, but hidden behind the papers was a hollowed-out book titled The Elements of Justice. Mark pulled it out. Inside the hollowed-out book was not the notebook, but a small brass key and a folded map of the village. The map had several marks on it, but one stood out, a large red X over the village church's bell tower. The final key. Mark whispered. Suddenly, the room was flooded with light. A powerful spotlight from outside hit the window, illuminating the dust motes in the air. A voice boomed through a megaphone, echoing against the school walls. Mr. Thorne. This is Officer Miller. You are trespassing on private property. Come out with your hands up. Now. Mark ducked below the window line. He looked at the brass key and the map. He couldn't get caught now. Not when he was so close. He looked around the office for another way out. He noticed a small service elevator used for moving books between floors. It was old, but it might still work. He heard the sound of heavy boots hitting the front steps. Miller wasn't alone. He could hear Henderson's rough voice too. They were coming for the evidence, and they weren't going to let him leave Stonebridge alive. Mark grabbed the brass key and the map, crawled toward the service elevator, and prayed it would hold his weight. Mark squeezed his body into the narrow service elevator. It was designed for stacks of heavy books, not for a grown man, but his adrenaline made him move with impossible agility. He gripped the thick, frayed ropes and lowered himself slowly. Above him, he heard the office door splinter and crash open. He was just here. Henderson's voice roared, muffled by the floorboards. Look for the list. Look for the key. The elevator creaked, a terrifying metallic groan that echoed in the small shaft. Mark held his breath, praying the old pulleys wouldn't snap. He reached the basement level and tumbled out onto the dusty floor just as he heard Miller shouting from the office window. Mark didn't wait. He scrambled through the broken basement window and sprinted into the thicket of trees surrounding the school. He didn't go for his car. It was a trap. Instead, he moved through the shadows of the back gardens, clutching the brass key and the map. His destination was the village church. It was a massive, ancient structure made of dark granite, its spire pointing toward the heavens like a silent witness. Mark entered through a small side door used by the choir. The interior of the church was vast and cold, filled with the scent of beeswax and old stone. He moved toward the back, finding the small, heavy wooden door that led to the bell tower. He began to climb. The stairs were a narrow spiral of stone, worn down by centuries of footsteps. His legs burned, and his breath came in ragged gasps. Finally, he reached the top. The belfry was open to the night air, protected only by wooden slats. In the center hung the great bell of Stonebridge, a massive bronze giant. Mark looked at the map again. The X was specifically marked near the support beams above the bell. He climbed a small iron ladder into the rafters. There, tucked behind a thick oak beam, was a small iron box. It was covered in 20 years of dust and cobwebs. Mark wiped the surface and saw a small keyhole. He took the brass key from his pocket. It slid in smoothly. He turned it, and the box popped open. Inside was a thick, leather-bound notebook and a small digital recorder. Mark opened the notebook. It was filled with Thomas Gray's neat handwriting, but the pages were covered in bank stamps, signatures, and dates. This was it, the package. It was the complete evidence of the stolen pension funds, the insurance fraud, and the names of every person involved, including those who had supposedly left the village. "You found it." A voice whispered from the darkness of the stairs. Mark spun around, nearly falling from the rafters. Standing at the top of the stairs was Julia. She looked battered, her coat torn, but her eyes were bright with a fierce light. "Julia, you're alive." Mark exhaled, the tension leaving his body for a split second. "Thomas hid it well," she said, stepping into the moonlight. "But we have to move. Miller saw your car. They know you're headed here. And Mark, Arthur Vance isn't the only one coming. Samuel Reed is back in town." Mark gripped the leather-bound notebook tightly. The cold air of the bell tower swirled around them, but the heat of the situation was rising. Julia stood near the edge of the stone stairs, her breath visible in the moonlight. She looked exhausted, her face smudged with dirt, but her presence was a relief. "How did you get away?" Mark whispered, moving down from the rafters to the belfry floor. "Vance and Miller," Julia said, her voice trembling. "They started arguing at the mill. Vance wants the money for what happened to Elena, but Miller just wants to bury the whole thing and keep his power." While they were shouting, I managed to slip out through a drainage pipe. I knew you'd find the key. Mark, Thomas always said you were the only one who wouldn't stop looking. "Where is Thomas?" Mark asked urgently. "He's still at the mill," Julia replied. "They moved him deeper into the basement ruins. But we have a bigger problem now. Look down." Mark peered through the wooden slats of the belfry. Below, the quiet churchyard was no longer empty. Officer Miller's police cruiser was there, its blue lights reflecting off the gravestones. Next to it sat Mr. Henderson's truck. But a third vehicle had just arrived, a sleek, expensive black sedan that looked completely out of place in Stonebridge. A man stepped out of the sedan. He was older, wearing a tailored grey overcoat that cost more than Mark's car. He moved with a cold, calculated grace. Even from this height, the authority he carried was obvious. "That's Samuel Reed," Julia whispered, her voice filled with dread. "The owner of the mill. He's the one who started it all. He didn't just leave the village 20 years ago. He rebuilt himself in the city using the stolen pension money. He's the one who's been pulling the strings from the shadows." The three men, Miller, Henderson, and Reed, stood in a circle near the church entrance. Reed seemed to be giving orders. Miller looked nervous, while Henderson looked like he wanted to break something. They were a trio of greed, fear, and power. "They know we're up here," Mark said, looking at the brass key still in his hand. "They saw the light. We can't let them get this notebook," Julia said. "It has the routing numbers for the offshore accounts. It's the only way to prove where the money went. If they get it, they'll destroy it, and Thomas will. He won't make it out of that mill." The heavy oak doors of the church below groaned as they were forced open. The sound echoed up the stone spiral of the bell tower. The hunt had moved from the streets to the sanctuary. Mark looked at the great bell hanging above them. It was a massive piece of bronze, silent for decades. "We have to get to the mill," Mark said, a plan forming in his mind. "We need to trade the notebook for Thomas. But we need a distraction. Something loud enough to draw everyone in the village to the square." Mark looked at the thick, heavy bell rope. He looked at Julia. "Do you remember how to ring a warning?" Mark looked at the thick, frayed rope hanging from the center of the belfry. It was made of heavy hemp, darkened by age. He knew that in a quiet village like Stonebridge, the sound of the great bell was a signal that could not be ignored. It was a call to the people, a warning of fire or danger, and it hadn't been rung in over 20 years. "Grab the rope with me," Mark commanded. Julia stepped forward, her eyes determined. Together, they gripped the rough fabric. Below, they could hear the heavy thud of boots on the stone stairs. Miller and Henderson were climbing fast. Samuel Reed would be waiting at the bottom, watching the exits. "On 3. Mark whispered. 1, 2, 3. They pulled down with their entire body weight. At first, nothing happened. The bell was massive, its iron gears stiff from decades of rust. They pulled again, a rhythmic, straining effort. Suddenly, there was a loud groan of metal, and the great bell tipped. The sound was deafening. It exploded in the small stone chamber, vibrating through Mark's chest and shaking the very floor beneath their feet. It was a deep, resonant boom that rolled out over the village, cutting through the fog and the silence of the night. Mark and Julia didn't stop. They pulled with a desperate energy. In the village below, lights began to flicker on in the small cottages. Windows were pushed open. The people of Stonebridge, who had lived in silence and fear for 20 years, were being woken up by the voice of their own history. "They're almost at the top," Julia shouted over the roar of the bell. Mark looked at the entrance to the belfry. He could see the flash of a flashlight reflecting off the curved stone wall of the staircase. He grabbed the leather-bound notebook and stuffed it into his jacket, zipping it tight. He then looked at the small iron ladder he had used to reach the rafters. "The roof," Mark said, pointing up. "There's a maintenance hatch for the gutters. We can't go back down the stairs." They scrambled up the ladder just as the door to the belfry was kicked open. Officer Miller burst into the room, his face twisted in a mask of rage, his service weapon drawn. Henderson was right behind him, gasping for air. The bell was still swinging, its iron tongue striking the bronze with a thunderous rhythm that made conversation impossible. Miller yelled something, but his voice was drowned out by the bell. He aimed his light at the rafters, catching the heel of Mark's boot as he disappeared through the hatch onto the steep, slate roof of the church. The cold night air hit Mark's face again. The roof was slick with frost and incredibly high. Below them, the village square was starting to fill with people. Men in coats over pajamas, women holding lanterns. The crowd was looking up at the tower, confused and frightened. "We have to get down the backside, near the ivy." Mark shouted to Julia. "If we reach the ground, the crowd will be our shield. Reed can't hurt us with the whole village watching." They began a terrifying crawl down the sloping slate. Mark could see Samuel Reed standing by his black sedan, looking up at the tower. For the first time, the mastermind looked worried. The silence he had bought with 20 years of lies was finally, loudly broken. Mark and Julia clung to the thick, ancient ivy that climbed the back wall of the church. The vines were as thick as ropes, but they were slick with the midnight dew. Below them, the village square was a sea of flickering lanterns and flashlights. The great bell was still tolling, though the rhythm was slowing as the heavy bronze lost its momentum. They reached the ground behind a large stone buttress. Mark's hands were scraped and bleeding, but he didn't feel the pain. He pulled the notebook from his jacket to ensure it was dry. "We have to get to the center of the square," Mark whispered. "If we stay in the shadows, Miller will catch us. We need witnesses." They rounded the corner of the church and stepped into the light of the square. The crowd of villagers gasped. Sarah the baker was there, wrapped in a heavy wool shawl. Mrs. Gable from the library stood next to her, clutching a lantern. "Mr. Thorne," Sarah called out, her voice trembling. "What is happening? Why did the bell ring?" Before Mark could answer, the heavy front doors of the church burst open. Officer Miller and Mr. Henderson ran out, their faces red with exertion and fury. Miller still had his hand on his holster. "Get back!" Miller shouted at the crowd. "This man is a fugitive. He's broken into the school and the church. He's dangerous." The villagers hesitated, stepping back. The habit of obeying Miller for 20 years was hard to break. But then, Samuel Reed stepped forward from his black sedan. He looked calm, his voice smooth and authoritative. "Good people of Stonebridge," Reed said, raising his hands. "I am Samuel Reed. Many of you remember me. This young man has stolen private property and is trying to stir up old, painful memories. Officer Miller is just doing his job. Please, return to your homes." Mark looked at the faces of the villagers. They were confused, caught between the authority of the men they knew and the mystery of the night. Mark realized he had to speak now, or the silence would swallow the truth again. "He's lying." Mark's voice rang out, clear and steady. He held up the leather-bound notebook. "This isn't just a story. This is the record of your lives. Samuel Reed didn't lose his money in the fire. He stole it. He took the pension funds that were meant for your fathers and grandfathers, and Miller and Henderson helped him cover it up." A murmur ran through the crowd. Mrs. Gable stepped forward, her eyes narrowing behind her glasses. "The pension funds. My husband worked at that mill for 30 years. We were told the records were burned in the fire." "They weren't burned," Mark said, opening the notebook to a page with a series of bank stamps. "They were moved to an offshore account 2 days before the fire started. Thomas Gray found the proof. That's why they've taken him." Reed's face turned a deathly shade of pale. He looked at Miller. "Officer, arrest him. Now. He is inciting a riot." Miller stepped toward Mark, but he stopped when he saw the look in the villagers' eyes. They weren't stepping back anymore. They were moving closer, a wall of angry, tired people who had been lied to for far too long. "Where is Thomas Gray? Arthur?" Sarah the baker asked, turning her gaze to Mr. Henderson. "We've known you all our lives. Tell us the truth." Henderson looked at the crowd, then at the powerful Samuel Reed, and finally at his own shaking hands. The pressure of 20 years of guilt was finally too much. "He's at the mill," Henderson whispered, his voice breaking. Reed told us to keep him there until the notebook was found." The crowd erupted in a roar of voices. The wall of silence hadn't just cracked, it had shattered. Mark looked at Julia. Now! We have to get to the mill before Reed's hired men get to Thomas. The village square transformed into a river of light as dozens of people carrying lanterns, flashlights, and torches followed Mark and Julia. They didn't take cars. The crowd moved on foot, a collective force of nature marching toward the ruins. Even Officer Miller, realizing his power was gone, walked silently at the edge of the group, his head bowed. Samuel Reed had vanished in his black sedan, but no one cared about him yet. Saving Thomas was the only priority. They reached the mill ruins in less than 20 minutes. The sound of the rushing river was louder now, a constant roar that echoed the heartbeat of the angry crowd. Mark led the way, stepping over the charred timber and mossy stones he now knew so well. He reached the north wall and pointed to the heavy stone with the iron ring. "Here!" Mark shouted. 4 strong villagers stepped forward. Together, they gripped the iron ring and pulled. With a massive, grinding screech, the hidden trapdoor slid open. A cloud of cold, stagnant air rose from the dark hole. Mark didn't wait for the others. He grabbed a flashlight and descended the rusty ladder, followed closely by Julia and 2 of the villagers. The basement was larger than it had appeared from the top. It was a labyrinth of stone pillars and low ceilings. The floor was covered in an inch of cold water. In the far corner, illuminated by a single, flickering lantern, sat a man tied to a wooden chair. He was thin, with grey hair and a face lined by exhaustion. "Thomas!" Julia cried out, splashing through the water toward him. Thomas Gray looked up, his eyes blinking against the sudden light. He looked weak, but when he saw Julia and Mark, a small, tired smile touched his lips. You found the notebook," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "We found everything, Thomas," Mark said, reaching for a pocket knife to cut the ropes. "Stop right there." The voice came from the shadows behind a heavy stone pillar. Arthur Vance stepped into the light. He wasn't holding a gun. He was holding a heavy iron bar, the same one he had used as a lever before. His face was a mask of grief and confusion. He looked at the crowd of villagers now pouring into the basement. "The money is gone, Arthur," Mark said, standing his ground. "Reed used it to build his empire in the city. He didn't just let Elena die. He used her death to cover his tracks. Look at these people. These are the families whose lives he ruined. You're protecting the man who destroyed everything you loved." Vance looked at the villagers, people he had known since he was a boy. He saw the anger in their eyes, but also the shared sorrow. He looked at Thomas, the man he had kept prisoner. Slowly, the iron bar slipped from his fingers and splashed into the shallow water. He said the notebook was the only way to get it back. Vance whispered, his voice breaking. "He said we'd be rich again. That I could leave this place. You can leave the lies behind, Arthur," Thomas said softly, his hands finally free. "That's the only way to be free." Vance slumped against the pillar, his head in his hands. The villagers moved past him, gently helping Thomas to his feet. As they carried the writer back toward the ladder, Mark felt a sense of completion. The empty desk was no longer empty. It was filled with the truth. The sun rose over Stonebridge, but it was not the grey, cold sun of the previous days. The sky was a clear, brilliant blue, and the morning light turned the frost on the trees into glittering diamonds. For the first time in 20 years, the shadows of the village felt thin and powerless. By 8 a.m., the village square was no longer a place of quiet fear. It was crowded with state police vehicles from the city. Mark had used his satellite phone to call his editor, who had alerted the regional authorities. These were not local men like Miller. They were investigators with no ties to the secrets of Stonebridge. Mark stood on the steps of the village office, watching the final pieces of the puzzle fall into place. Samuel Reed had been caught at the highway interchange, his black sedan filled with packed suitcases and bags of cash. Officer Miller and Mr. Henderson were taken away in handcuffs, their heads bowed in shame as the villagers they had once intimidated watched in silence. Dr. Aries had spent the morning giving a full, recorded confession to the state investigators. Because of his cooperation and his age, he was allowed to remain at home under guard. Arthur Vance was also cooperating. The loss of his wife and the weight of his grief had finally broken his loyalty to the criminals who had used him. Mark visited Thomas Gray later that afternoon. The writer was resting in his own bed, his house finally warm and filled with the smell of tea and toast. Julia sat by his side, her hand in his. The house no longer felt like a place of secrets. It felt like a home. "You saved more than just me, Mark," Thomas said, his voice stronger now. "You saved this village from its own silence. The pension money has been frozen in those offshore accounts. It will take time, but the families will finally get what was stolen from them." Mark looked at the empty desk in the corner of the room. "And the book?" "The real empty desk." Thomas smiled. "I think I have a new ending for it now. A much better one." Mark left Stonebridge that evening. As he drove his blue car past the old Stonebridge and the Welcome to Stonebridge sign, he felt a sense of peace. He had come looking for a story about a missing writer, but he had found a story about the power of truth. He reached into his bag and felt the leather-bound notebook. He would hand it over to the city detectives tonight. But first, he had an article to write. He already knew the headline. It wasn't about a crime, or a fire, or a hidden basement. It was about a village that finally decided to wake up. The road ahead was open and bright. Mark Thorne, the journalist from the city, drove into the sunset, leaving the shadows of Stonebridge behind him forever. Mark Thorne drove into the heart of the city as the sun began to dip behind the jagged skyline of glass and steel. The transition from the rural silence of Stonebridge to the frantic, neon-lit energy of the metropolis was jarring. After days of dodging local police and navigating dark basements, the city felt like a different planet. Yet, as he merged into the thick traffic of the business district, the paranoia didn't fade, it intensified. He found himself checking his rearview mirror every few seconds, watching for the sleek silhouette of a black sedan or any vehicle that lingered too long in his wake. He knew that while the local players in Stonebridge were behind bars, the true architect, Samuel Reed, had connections that reached deep into the city's foundation. He arrived at his apartment in the North End, a modest fourth-floor walk-up. He didn't use the elevator, opting for the stairs to avoid being trapped in a small space. When he reached his door, he paused. The tiny, nearly invisible piece of clear tape he always placed near the bottom of the doorframe was gone. Someone had been inside. Mark drew a deep breath, his hand instinctively gripping the leather-bound notebook tucked beneath his jacket. He pushed the door open slowly. The apartment was a disaster. His bookshelves had been cleared, the covers of his novels torn off. His mattress was sliced open, and his laptop had been smashed into pieces on the floor. It wasn't just a search, it was a message. They wanted him to know that nowhere was safe. Mark didn't turn on the lights. He moved through the shadows, heading for a loose floorboard beneath his desk. To his relief, the emergency burner phone and the backup cache were still there. He grabbed them and retreated immediately. He couldn't stay here. He drove to a low-rent motel on the edge of the industrial district, a place where no one asked for real names and the air smelled of stale tobacco. Sitting on the edge of a stained bed, he opened Thomas Gray's notebook to the final, cryptic page. Beneath the bank routing numbers and the names of corrupt officials was a small, hand-drawn symbol, a snake eating its own tail. Next to it was a single address in the city's financial heart and a time, 2 a.m. Mark realized then that Stonebridge was merely a pilot program for something far more sinister. The pension funds stolen from the mill workers were just a drop in the bucket compared to the billions being funneled through the city's legitimate-looking investment firms. Samuel Reed wasn't just a thief. He was a middleman for a shadow organization that fed on the life savings of the working class. Mark felt a cold shiver. He was no longer just a journalist covering a local mystery. He was an accidental whistleblower for a conspiracy that could topple the city's elite. He looked at the burner phone. He needed an ally, someone who knew how to navigate the city's darkest corners. He dialed a number he hadn't used in years. The next morning, Mark stood outside the towering glass building of the Daily Chronicle. This was his home, the place where he had built his reputation as a hard-hitting investigative reporter. He expected to feel a sense of security as he passed through the lobby's metal detectors. But the security guards looked at him with a strange, cold intensity. He ignored them and rode the elevator to the 12th floor. When he stepped into the newsroom, the usual frantic clatter of keyboards and ringing phones seemed to dampen. His colleagues looked up, some with pity, others with guarded expressions. He walked straight to the office of Julian Sterling, the editor-in-chief. Sterling was a man Mark had respected for a decade, a veteran journalist who always preached the importance of the unfiltered truth. "Mark, you're back," Sterling said, though he didn't look up from his desk. He looked tired, his face pale in the harsh fluorescent light. "I heard about the trouble in Stonebridge. The police report says you were involved in some trespassing and property damage." Mark threw the notebook onto Sterling's desk. "Forget the trespassing, Julian. This is it. This is the story of the century. Samuel Reed, the mill fire, the pension theft. It's all linked to a firm right here in the city called Aegis Holdings. It's a massive money laundering operation. Thomas Gray is safe, and he's ready to testify." Sterling finally looked up, but there was no spark of excitement in his eyes. Instead, there was fear. He didn't even touch the notebook. "Mark, listen to me. I've been told to kill the story. We received a cease and desist from Aegis's legal team before you even crossed the city limits. They're claiming libel and harassment. The board of directors at the Chronicle, they've already made a decision. You're being placed on indefinite administrative leave." Mark felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. "The board? Julian, look at the evidence. Thousands of people lost their livelihoods so these men could buy yachts and penthouses. You've always said." "I know what I said," Sterling snapped, his voice cracking. "But this is bigger than us. Mark, Aegis Holdings owns the bank that holds our paper's debt. They own the printing presses. If we run this, the Chronicle closes its doors by Friday, and 200 people lose their jobs. I can't let you burn this house down for one story." "It's not just a story, Julian. It's the truth," Mark said, his voice low and dangerous. He reached out and snatched the notebook back. "If you walk out of here with that, Mark, you're on your own." Sterling warned. "No legal protection, no press credentials. You'll be a private citizen with powerful enemies." "I was on my own in Stonebridge," Mark replied, turning toward the door. "And I did just fine. Tell the board they can keep the job. I'm keeping the truth." As he walked out of the newsroom, he felt the eyes of the entire staff on him. He was no longer a reporter for the city's biggest paper. He was a rogue element in a city owned by the very people he was trying to expose. Mark sat in a crowded subway station, his hood pulled low. He watched the trains roar by, the gust of wind and noise providing a temporary shield for his thoughts. He had been cut off from his resources. No office, no legal team, and his apartment was compromised. He felt the weight of the notebook in his bag, a heavy, silent burden. He realized he couldn't fight Aegis Holdings in the light of the day. He needed to go underground. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the burner phone. A message was waiting for him. It was a single line of code, an encrypted key that led to a secure chat room. He followed the instructions, his fingers moving quickly over the small keypad. "I heard you kicked the hornet's nest." A message appeared on the screen. The sender was Wraith. Wraith was a legendary hacker Mark had helped years ago by keeping his identity out of a story about a high-profile data breach. Since then, Wraith had become Mark's ghost, a source who lived in the digital shadows, seeing things that didn't exist on paper. "The nest is bigger than I thought." Mark typed back, "I need to know about Aegis Holdings. Specifically, their connection to a project called Ouroboros." There was a long pause. Then, "You're playing with fire, Thorne. Ouroboros isn't just a project. It's an algorithm. It's designed to predict economic shifts and trigger minor collapses in small-town infrastructures. They buy the debt, trigger a crisis, and then harvest the insurance and pension funds. Stonebridge was a test site. They're planning to scale it up to a dozen more towns by the end of the year." Mark felt a cold knot of dread. This wasn't just about the past. It was about the future. "I have the manual records from the Stonebridge site. How do I stop the algorithm?" "You can't stop it from the outside." Wraith replied, "The Ouroboros server is air-gapped. It's not connected to the internet. It's located in the sub-basement of the Aegis Tower. You'd need physical access to the terminal to upload the decryption keys from Thomas's notebook." "Then that's where I'm going." Mark sent. "It's a fortress, Mark. Private security, biometric scanners, and a direct line to the police department. You'll never get past the lobby." "I have something they want." Mark typed, looking at the notebook. The manual logs are the only things that can prove the algorithm was intentionally manipulated. Without these logs, their insurance claims are void. "They'll come for me. And when they do, I'm going to let them take me right into the heart of the tower." Mark closed the phone and stood up. He had a plan. But it was suicide. He needed one more thing. He needed the man who had started this all to see it through to the end. He headed toward the train that would take him to the outskirts of the city, to a safe house where Julia had taken Thomas Gray. The team was getting back together. But this time, the battlefield was a skyscraper, and the stakes were the survival of every small town in the country. The safe house was a dilapidated warehouse on the industrial fringe of the city, hidden behind a maze of shipping containers and rusting machinery. Mark arrived under the cover of a freezing drizzle, his eyes scanning the rooftops for snipers or drones. He knocked a rhythmic code on the heavy steel door. It opened just a crack, revealing Julia's wary eyes. She pulled him inside quickly, the scent of motor oil and old wood filling his senses. In the center of the vast, hollow space, Thomas Gray sat hunched over a flickering laptop, his face illuminated by the blue light of the screen. He looked frail, but his eyes possessed a sharp, frantic energy. The room was cluttered with maps of the city's power grid and schematics of the Aegis Tower. "You're late," Thomas said without looking up. "I've been tracing the Ouroboros packet signals. They've accelerated the timeline. 3 more towns, Oak Creek, Silverton, and Clear Lake, are scheduled for market adjustments within the next 48 hours. People are going to lose their homes. Mark." Mark set the leather-bound notebook on the table. "I know. The Chronicle killed the story. Aegis owns the debt. We're on our own." Julia handed Mark a cup of bitter black coffee. "We're not entirely alone. Wraith has been helping us from the digital side. But he's right. The algorithm is locked behind a physical firewall. Thomas, tell him what you found." Thomas turned the laptop toward Mark. "I didn't just stumble upon the Stonebridge records, Mark. Years ago, before I became a writer, I was a consultant for a firm that eventually became Aegis. I helped write the core logic for the Ouroboros predictive model. I thought it was for disaster relief, to predict where resources would be needed most. They turned it into a weapon to predict where the most profit could be extracted from a tragedy. The realization hit Mark like a physical blow. So you're the fail-safe. You know the back door. I know the logic. Thomas corrected. But they've changed the encryption keys. The notebook you have contains the original cipher seeds. If we can get me to a terminal inside the Aegis subbasement, I can overwrite the algorithm's target list with a null command. It would effectively lobotomize Ouroboros. We can't get you in there, Thomas. Mark said firmly. You're barely standing. I'll take the drive. Wraith can talk me through the interface. It's not just a drive, Mark. Thomas said, pointing to the notebook. The codes are written in a shorthand only I can interpret in real time. If you make one mistake, the system will wipe itself, and the evidence will be gone forever. The only way to stop them is for both of us to go in. Mark looked at the schematics of the Aegis Tower. It was a vertical fortress. The lobby is a death trap. Every floor is monitored by AI-driven facial recognition. Then we don't use the lobby, Julia said, spreading a map of the city's old subway tunnels on the table. The Aegis Tower was built over an abandoned 1920s station. The service tunnels still exist. They use them for the cooling pipes. If we can navigate the dark, we can come up directly through the floor of the server room. The air in the abandoned subway tunnels was thick with the smell of wet concrete and ancient dust. Mark, Thomas, and Julia moved in single file, their flashlights casting long, distorted shadows against the grime-covered walls. Thomas moved slowly, leaning on a cane, but his resolve was unshakable. Mark carried the notebook and a specialized decryption device Wraith had sent via a courier. We're directly beneath 5th and Main, Julia whispered, checking a handheld GPS. The Aegis Foundation should be another 100 yards ahead. Watch for the pressure sensors. They've probably rigged the old tunnels with vibration detectors. The silence of the underground was punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic thrum of the city above. It felt as if they were walking through the veins of a sleeping giant. Suddenly, the thrumming stopped. A heavy, metallic clack echoed through the tunnel. Kill the lights, Mark hissed. They plunged into total darkness. Seconds later, a red glow appeared at the far end of the tunnel. A security drone, floating silently on silent rotors, began to sweep the area with a crimson laser. The beam danced across the walls, inching closer to their position behind a rusted maintenance cart. Mark felt his heart pounding. If the drone spotted them, the mission would end before it began. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small electromagnetic pulse grenade Wraith had provided. It was a one-shot tool. Wait for it, Mark whispered to Julia and Thomas. The drone drifted closer, its mechanical eye whirring as it processed the shadows. When it was 10 feet away, Mark tossed the grenade. There was a faint pop and a ripple of blue static. The drone's red light flickered and died, and the machine crashed to the floor with a dull thud. Go, go, Mark urged. They scrambled forward, reaching a massive concrete wall that bore the faded markings of the Aegis construction project. Julia found the access hatch, a heavy iron door obscured by decades of trash. Mark used a crowbar to pry it open, revealing a vertical ladder that led into a brightly lit shaft. This is it, Julia said, her voice grim. The cooling shaft. It leads straight to the sub-basement level B4. Once you're up there, I'll head back to the surface to act as your eyes and ears through the radio. If things go sideways, I'm the one who leaks the notebook to the internet. Mark looked at Thomas, then at Julia. Stay safe. If you don't hear from us in an hour, get out of the city. Julia nodded, squeezed Mark's hand, and disappeared back into the darkness of the tunnel. Mark and Thomas began the long, arduous climb toward the belly of the beast. The server room of Aegis Holdings was a cathedral of technology. Row after row of black towers hummed with a low, aggressive vibration. The air was frigid, chilled to protect the massive processors that were currently calculating the financial ruin of 3 American towns. Blue and green LED lights flickered like the eyes of a digital beast. Mark helped Thomas into a chair in front of the central console. The room was supposedly empty, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. "I'm in," Thomas whispered, his fingers dancing across the keyboard with a grace that defied his age. "The Ouroboros core is active. It's beautiful and horrifying. Look at the data streams. Mark. It's not just pension funds anymore. It's medical records, property deeds, insurance payouts. It's a total harvest." "Focus, Thomas," Mark said, his eyes darting toward the heavy security door. "How long to upload the null command?" "The encryption is shifting every 10 seconds. Thomas muttered, sweat beadling on his forehead. "I need to input the cipher seeds from the notebook manually. Page 42, now." As Mark flipped the pages, a voice boomed over the room's intercom system. It wasn't the voice of a security guard or an automated system. It was the calm, cultured voice of Samuel Reed. "I must admit, Mr. Thorne, your persistence is admirable. To travel from the ruins of a small-town mill to the pinnacle of global finance, it's quite the hero's journey." The large screen at the front of the room flickered to life. Samuel Reed sat in a leather chair in a darkened office, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He looked bored, as if Mark and Thomas were merely a minor distraction in his schedule. "You're too late, of course," Reed continued. "The algorithm isn't just a program anymore. It's a living market entity. Even if you shut down this server, the mirrored cores in London and Singapore will take over within milliseconds. You're trying to stop a tide with a bucket. Every tide has a turning point." "Reed," Mark shouted toward the camera, "we have the logs. We have the proof that you murdered Elena Vance and framed the town." "Proof is a subjective term in a world built on data," Reed countered. "And data can be deleted. Like you." The security doors hissed open. 2 men in tactical gear, carrying silenced submachine guns, stepped into the room. They didn't move like ordinary guards. They moved like predators. Mark stepped in front of Thomas, his hand reaching for the only weapon he had, the heavy, metal-cased decryption device. "Keep typing, Thomas," Mark said, his voice cold. "Don't look back." As the first guard raised his weapon, the room was suddenly plunged into darkness. A voice crackled over the internal speakers. Wraith's voice. "I found a back door into the lighting grid. You've got 60 seconds of darkness. Mark. Make them count." The darkness in the server room was absolute, a thick, velvet blackness that smelled of ozone and recycled air. Mark's world narrowed down to the sound of his own breathing and the frantic, rhythmic tapping of Thomas's fingers on the keyboard behind him. He knew he was outmatched. The men in tactical gear were professionals, trained to kill in any environment. But Mark had spent the last week living in shadows and ruins. He knew how to move when the world went dark. He didn't stand his ground. He dropped to his knees and crawled toward the first row of server racks. He heard the hiss of a silenced shot, the bullet thudding into the plastic casing of a processor near where his head had been a second ago. The guards were using thermal goggles. "Wraith," Mark whispered into his lapel missy. "The thermals. I need heat. On it." Wraith's voice crackled, triggering the emergency fire suppression system. Now. Suddenly, the overhead nozzles didn't spray water. They hissed as a cloud of hot, pressurized CO2 and steam flooded the room. The temperature spiked instantly, creating a chaotic wall of heat that blinded the guards' thermal optics. Mark saw the hazy, orange glow of the server lights through the mist. He reached out and grabbed a heavy fire extinguisher from the wall. He heard a guard cursing just a few feet away, struggling to pull off his useless goggles. Mark didn't hesitate. He swung the heavy metal canister with all his strength, catching the guard in the side of the helmet. The man went down with a muffled groan. Mark didn't wait to check if he was conscious. He dove toward the second guard, who was blindly firing a burst of lead into the steam. The bullets shredded a cooling pipe, and a jet of freezing liquid sprayed across the room. Mark used the distraction to tackle the man's waist. They crashed into a server rack, the metal groaning under the impact. Mark was smaller, but he was desperate. He grabbed the guard's wrist, slamming it against the sharp edge of the rack until the submachine gun clattered to the floor. "Thomas! How much longer?" Mark yelled, pinning the guard's arm. 10 seconds. Thomas cried out. "I just need to bypass the final handshake." The guard Mark was holding surged with strength, throwing Mark off and reaching for a combat knife. Mark scrambled back, his hand hitting the heavy decryption device on the floor. He swung it upward just as the guard lunged. The heavy box connected with the man's chin, sending him sprawling into the dark. At that moment, the lights flickered back to life, but they weren't the steady blue of before. They were a pulsing, angry red. A siren began to wail, a high-pitched scream that signaled a total system breach. "It's done." Thomas gasped, slumped over the console. "The null command is in the buffer. Ouroboros is eating its own tail." On the large screen, Samuel Reed's face was no longer calm. His features were twisted in a mask of sheer disbelief. "You fools!" he hissed. "You think you've won? You've just triggered the building's sanitized protocol. In 5 minutes, the sub-basement will be flooded with halon gas to protect the hardware from unauthorized tampering. You'll be dead before the algorithm even finishes crashing." The red lights continued to pulse, casting long, bloody shadows across the server room. The sanitized protocol was a brutal failsafe designed to protect Aegis's most valuable secrets by suffocating any living thing in the room. Halon gas was odorless and colorless, but it worked by displacing oxygen. Mark felt the first pang of a headache, a sign that the air was already changing. "We have to go, Thomas!" Mark shouted, grabbing the older man's arm. "Wait," Thomas said, his eyes fixed on the screen. "Look at the data. The null command. It didn't just stop the algorithm. It's downloading the entire transaction history of the last 20 years to a remote server. Everything. Mark. Every bribe, every stolen cent, every name. Where is it going?" Mark asked, pulling Thomas toward the heavy security door they had entered through. "To every major news outlet in the country," Thomas whispered. "And to the Department of Justice. It's a dead man's switch I programmed into the logic years ago. If the system was ever forcefully overwritten, it would vomit out its own heart." Mark felt a surge of hope, but it was quickly dampened as he reached the security door. He pulled the handle, but it didn't budge. The magnetic locks were engaged. They were trapped in a room that was rapidly losing its air. "Wraith!" "The door!" Mark barked into his emissary. "I'm locked out." Wraith's voice sounded frantic. "Reed has initiated a hardline override from the penthouse. The elevators are dead. The stairs are sealed. He's turning the tower into a tomb." Mark looked around the room. The tactical guards were still unconscious on the floor, their breathing shallow as the gas began to fill the lower levels of the room. He didn't have much time. He looked at the heavy server racks. They were bolted to the floor, but the cooling pipes, the ones he had seen earlier. The cooling shaft. Mark realized. "We came in through the maintenance hatch. If we can get back into that shaft, the air pressure from the fans might push the halon back." He dragged Thomas toward the back of the room, near where the steam had been hissing. He found the access hatch, but it was sealed with a digital keypad that was now glowing with the same sanitize warning. Thomas, the code. Thomas looked at the keypad, his vision blurring. It's a derivative of the fire date. October 14th, but in reverse. The hatch swung open, and a blast of cold, oxygen-rich air hit them. Mark practically threw Thomas into the shaft and scrambled in after him, slamming the hatch shut just as the first thick clouds of halon began to settle on the floor of the server room. They were safe from the gas, but they were still 4 stories underground in a building owned by a man who wanted them dead. Inside the cooling shaft, the roar of the massive ventilation fans was like the sound of a jet engine. Mark and Thomas clung to the narrow metal ladder, the vibration rattling their teeth. They couldn't go back down into the subway tunnels. Reed would have security teams waiting there by now. Their only option was up. "Julia, can you hear me?" Mark shouted into his radio. "Mark." "Thank God." Julia's voice came through, distorted by the metal around them. "The building is in total lockdown. I can see police cars and Aegis security units surrounding the perimeter. But they aren't looking for you anymore. The data dump worked. The news is already breaking. Every screen in Times Square is showing the Ouroboros logs. We're in the cooling shaft," Mark said, his muscles aching as he helped Thomas climb. "We need a way out that isn't the lobby." "Listen to me," Julia said, her voice turning urgent. "The cooling shaft exits onto the 5th-floor terrace, near the executive gym. From there, you can reach the external window washing platform. It's the only way down that isn't monitored by the internal security grid." They climbed for what felt like hours, their hands raw from the cold metal. Finally, they reached a heavy grate. Mark kicked it open, and they tumbled out onto a manicured garden terrace high above the city streets. The air was freezing, but it felt wonderful compared to the halon-filled basement. Below them, the city was in chaos. Thousands of people were gathering in the streets, holding up their phones, showing the leaked documents. The wall of silence that had protected Samuel Reed for 20 years hadn't just broken in Stonebridge. It was shattering across the entire nation. "There." Mark pointed to the window washing rig, a heavy metal platform suspended by thick steel cables. They scrambled onto the platform. Mark found the manual override controls. As the platform began its slow, mechanical descent down the glass face of the skyscraper, Mark looked through the windows of the executive offices. He saw people shredding papers, others staring in shock at their computer screens. Then, he saw him. Samuel Reed was standing by the window of his penthouse office, 40 floors above. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He was just standing there, watching the platform descend, a look of cold, quiet defeat on his face. He held a small, silver object in his hand, the locket that Arthur Vance had mentioned, the one Elena had gone back for. Mark realized that even in his greed and cruelty, Reed was a man haunted by the same fire as everyone else. But the fire had finally caught up to him. The platform reached the sidewalk. A crowd of reporters and police officers swarmed forward. Mark stepped off, holding the notebook high in the air. He saw Julia running toward them, her face streaked with tears and joy. He turned back to look at the Aegis Tower. It was no longer a fortress. It was a monument to a fallen empire. Mark Thorne, the journalist who had started with an empty desk, finally had the story that would change the world. The moment Mark's feet hit the pavement, the world exploded into a cacophony of camera flashes and shouting voices. The air was thick with the scent of rain and exhaust, but for Mark, it felt like the first time he had breathed in weeks. He held the notebook against his chest like a shield. Dozens of microphones were thrust into his face, but his eyes were fixed on the line of police officers moving toward them. "Mark Thorne, step away from the platform." A voice barked through a megaphone. It was a standoff. On one side, the city's tactical units, their loyalties still unclear. On the other, a growing crowd of citizens who had seen the Ouroboros leaks on their phones. Among the officers, a woman in a plain grey suit stepped forward. She didn't have the cold, robotic stare of the Aegis guards. Her badge identified her as Detective Elena Rios of the White Collar Crime Division. "Mr. Thorne," Rios said, her voice calm despite the surrounding chaos. "I'm with the State Attorney's office. We've been monitoring the data packets being broadcast from this building. If what's in that notebook matches the digital logs, we have enough to shut down every Aegis asset in the country." Before Mark could respond, a group of men in sharp, dark suits pushed through the police line. These were the Aegis legal team, the cleaners. Their lead counsel, a man with silver hair and a razor-thin smile, pointed a finger at Mark. "That notebook is the intellectual property of Aegis Holdings." The lawyer shouted. "It was stolen from a secure facility. Detective, I demand you arrest these men and return our property immediately. Any delay will result in a federal lawsuit against the department." Mark felt Thomas stiffen beside him. The legal pressure was a different kind of weapon, one that could be just as lethal as a bullet. If the notebook was confiscated as stolen evidence, it could be locked away in an evidence locker for years, or simply disappear. "It's not property," Mark countered, his voice booming so the nearby reporters could hear. "It's a record of a crime. It's the confession of a ghost." Detective Rios looked at the lawyers, then at Mark, and finally at the thousands of people watching through their phone cameras. She knew the world was a witness. She reached out her hand, not for Mark's handcuffs, but for the notebook. "I'll take it into protective custody," Rios declared, "under the Whistleblower Protection Act. Mr. Thorne, Mr. Gray, you're coming with me to the federal building. Anyone who tries to interfere will be charged with obstruction of justice." The Aegis lawyers looked as if they had been slapped, as Rios led Mark, Thomas, and Julia toward a waiting armored transport. Mark looked back at the Aegis tower. The lights in the penthouse were still on, but the shadow it cast over the city felt shorter. The legal battle had begun, but the war was far from over. Inside the secure confines of the federal building, the atmosphere was one of controlled panic. Detective Rios had brought in a team of forensic accountants and digital specialists to verify the notebook's contents. Thomas sat at a high-end workstation, his hands shaking but his mind focused, helping the technicians navigate the cryptic shorthand he had written years ago. "We have a problem," one of the technicians announced, his face pale. "The remote servers that received the data dump. They're being hit. A massive, coordinated DDoS attack is overwhelming the news outlet servers. At the same time, a virus has been triggered within the Aegis mainframe. It's called the Clean Slate Protocol." "What does that mean?" Mark asked, leaning over the desk. "It's a self-destruct for data," Thomas whispered, his eyes widening in horror. "Reed isn't trying to hide the truth anymore. He's trying to erase the entire financial history of the last decade. If Clean Slate finishes its cycle, every record of the pension thefts, every bank transfer, and every offshore account will be wiped. The proof will vanish, and the money will be trapped in dead accounts that only Reed can access later." "How long do we have?" Rios demanded. 10 minutes. The technician replied. "Maybe less. It's an encrypted wipe. We can't stop it from here because the trigger is coming from an internal hardline within the Aegis penthouse." Mark realized the game wasn't over. Samuel Reed hadn't stayed in that office to surrender. He had stayed to finish the job. He was the only one who could stop the wipe, or the only one who had the physical kill switch. "Wraith, are you there?" Mark spoke into his hidden MIC. "I'm trying, Mark, but Reed has cut the external fiber lines." Wraith's voice was filled with static. "The penthouse is a digital island. You need a physical connection to the terminal in his office to inject a countervirus. But the building is surrounded. You'll never get back in. Mark looked at Julia. She was looking at the map of the city, the window washing platform. She said, "It's still at the bottom. The police haven't cleared it yet because they're focused on the lobby." "No," Thomas said, standing up. "There's a faster way. The building has a private helipad. Reed has a chopper on standby. If he gets on that helicopter after the wipe is complete, he's gone forever." Mark turned to Detective Rios. "I need a ride. And I need a radio link to Thomas. We're going to the roof." Rios didn't hesitate. She grabbed her keys and a tactical vest. "We have a helicopter on the roof of this building. We can be at the Aegis Tower in 3 minutes. But Mark, if Reed triggers the wipe, there's no going back." As the police helicopter soared over the city, the lights of the metropolis looked like a circuit board below them. Mark gripped the door handle, watching the Aegis Tower grow larger in the windshield. He had the decryption device in his hand, loaded with Thomas's antivirus. "Mark, listen to me." Thomas's voice came through the headset, clear and urgent. "I've been digging deeper into the encrypted layers of the notebook while the techs were busy. Reed isn't the top of the pyramid. He's just the treasurer." Mark frowned. "What are you talking about?" "The Ouroboros algorithm wasn't funded by Aegis alone." Thomas explained. "I found a list of hidden shareholders. It's called the Shadow Council. It's a group of 7 individuals. CEOs of major defense contractors, a sitting senator, and a high-ranking official in the Treasury. Reed was the one who managed the harvest for them. If he wipes the data, he's not just saving himself, he's protecting the most powerful people in the country." The stakes had just shifted from a local conspiracy to a national crisis. If Mark could stop the wipe, he wouldn't just be taking down a corrupt businessman, he would be exposing the rot at the very heart of the system. "We're approaching the helipad," the pilot shouted. Through the window, Mark saw a private executive helicopter, its rotors already spinning. A figure in a grey overcoat was walking toward it, carrying a silver briefcase. It was Samuel Reed. He looked up at the approaching police chopper, his expression unreadable. "He's going to jump," Julia yelled from the back of the cabin. The police helicopter hovered over the pad, the downdraft kicking up a storm of gravel and debris. Mark didn't wait for a ladder. As the pilot brought the bird low, Mark leaped onto the concrete roof, rolling and coming up into a sprint. "Reed, stop!" Mark shouted over the roar of the engines. Reed turned, the silver briefcase gripped tightly in his hand. He stood at the edge of the helipad, the city lights reflecting in his eyes. He didn't look afraid. He looked like a man who had already accepted his fate. "You're a persistent ghost, Mr. Thorne," Reed said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "But you don't understand. This world isn't built on truth. It's built on the management of chaos. If you expose the council, you don't bring justice. You bring a collapse that will make Stonebridge look like a paradise." "I'll take that risk," Mark said, holding out the decryption device. "The people deserve to know who's been stealing their lives." Reed looked at the briefcase, then at the city below. "The clean slate is already at 90%. In 60 seconds, the council remains in the shadows, and I walk away a very wealthy man in a country that will never find me." He stepped toward his waiting helicopter, but Mark saw something Reed didn't. In the shadow of the cooling vents, a dark figure emerged. It was Arthur Vance. He had escaped his guards and followed the trail of his own revenge to the very top. He held no gun, only the rusted metal bar from the mill. "For Elena," Vance whispered. The rooftop of the Aegis Tower was a battleground of wind and noise. The downdraft from the two hovering helicopters created a swirling vortex of grit that stung Mark's eyes. Samuel Reed stood frozen, caught between the spinning blades of his escape and the ghost of the man he had betrayed 20 years ago. Arthur Vance, clothes torn and eyes burning with a hollow, vengeful light, stepped forward. The iron bar in his hand looked ancient, a relic of the mill that Reed had turned into a tomb. "Arthur, be reasonable," Reed shouted, his voice cracking. He clutched the silver briefcase to his chest. "I can give you everything. More than the mill ever made. You can start over. A new life, for Elena. Don't you speak her name." Vance growled, his voice a low vibration that seemed to cut through the roar of the engines. "You didn't just take her life, Samuel. You took her memory and turned it into a line on a ledger. You made her part of a harvest." Mark moved slowly to the side, trying to close the distance to the briefcase. "Arthur, don't do this. If you kill him now, the clean slate protocol finishes. The evidence dies with him. Elena doesn't get justice. She gets erased." Reed looked at Mark, a frantic sneer on his face. 30 seconds. Mr. Thorne. That's all that's left. By the time the police land, this briefcase will have sent the kill signal to every server in the network. The Shadow Council will remain in the light, and I will be the only one who can offer you a deal. Vance didn't listen. He lunged. The iron bar swung in a wide arc, clattering against the side of the silver briefcase as Reed raised it to protect his head. The impact sent a jar through both men. Reed stumbled back toward the edge of the helipad, his heels inches from the sheer drop to the city below. "The briefcase!" Mark yelled, diving forward. The briefcase skittered across the wet concrete, sliding toward the spinning tail rotor of the executive helicopter. Mark scrambled on his hands and knees, his fingers brushing the cold metal handle just as the timer on the internal display hit 15 seconds. Vance had Reed pinned against the safety railing. He wasn't swinging the bar anymore. He had his hands around Reed's throat. The powerful CEO, the man who had manipulated the lives of thousands, looked small and fragile in the grip of a man who had nothing left to lose. "Arthur, let him go," Mark shouted, his hand finally closing over the briefcase. He flipped it open. The screen inside was a blur of red text. "Deletion in progress." Mark frantically pulled the decryption device from his pocket. He needed a direct port. He saw a specialized data jack inside the briefcase. "Thomas. I'm in. I'm connecting the antivirus now. Hurry, Mark." Thomas's voice crackled through the earpiece. "The wipe is hitting the core. If it reaches 95%, the encryption becomes irreversible." Mark's fingers flew over the interface. He slammed the decryption device into the briefcase's port. Blue light flickered against the red glare of the deletion screen. "Connection established. Uploading Phoenix protocol." On the edge of the roof, the struggle had reached its tipping point. Arthur Vance had Reed hoisted partially over the railing. Below them, 40 stories of glass and steel plummeted into the dark streets. Reed was gasping for air, his face turning a deep, bruised purple. "Arthur, look at me," Mark screamed, looking up from the screen. "If you drop him, you become the monster he told everyone you were. You're better than him. You're a man of Stonebridge." Vance's grip faltered for a fraction of a second. He looked down at the man who had ruined his life, then back at Mark. In that moment, the iron-willed vengeance seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a crushing, ancient exhaustion. He pulled Reed back onto the concrete, throwing him down like a piece of discarded trash. "He's not worth the fall," Vance whispered, his voice disappearing into the wind. Mark turned back to the briefcase. Deletion halted. Recovery in progress. "It's working." Mark cheered, but his triumph was short-lived. The pilot of Reed's executive helicopter, seeing his employer captured and the authorities closing in, decided to save himself. He pulled the collective, and the helicopter lurched upward and away from the roof. The sudden gust of the takeoff caught the open briefcase, flipping it over. Mark grabbed the handle, but the decryption device was ripped from the port as the briefcase slammed shut and slid toward the ledge. Mark lunged, catching the edge of the silver case just as it tipped over the side. He was lying flat on the roof, his arm extended over the abyss, holding the weight of the entire conspiracy in one hand. "Mark!" Julia's voice screamed as the police helicopter landed behind them. Detective Rios and a tactical team swarmed the roof, weapons drawn. They tackled Samuel Reed and surrounded Arthur Vance, who didn't resist. "Give me your hand, Thorne!" Rios yelled, reaching for his belt to pull him back from the edge. Mark gripped the briefcase with white-knuckled intensity. The data was safe, but the weight of it felt like lead. As Rios pulled him back to safety, Mark collapsed onto the concrete, clutching the silver case to his chest. The red lights of the tower were being replaced by the blue and red flashes of 100 police cars below. The clean slate had failed. The phoenix had risen. The federal building was transformed into a command center for the greatest financial investigation in history. With the briefcase recovered and the Phoenix Protocol successfully restoring the wiped data, the truth began to pour out like a broken dam. Mark, Thomas, and Julia sat in a glass-walled conference room, watching the screens as the names of the Shadow Council were finally revealed. It wasn't just a list. It was a map of systemic rot. "Senator Harrison," Thomas whispered, pointing to the screen. He was the one who pushed through the legislation to deregulate the mill's insurance requirements. And there, Jameson, the CEO of Global Logistics. He's the one who provided the private security that acted as Reed's muscle. The data didn't just show the theft, it showed the why. The Ouroboros algorithm was being sold to foreign entities as a tool for economic warfare. Stonebridge had been the sacrifice for a product that was meant to be sold to the highest bidder. By dawn, the arrests began. In penthouses across the city and mansions in D.C., the members of the council were taken into custody. The news was a tidal wave. The public, fueled by the evidence Mark had fought for, occupied the streets. It wasn't a riot. It was a reckoning. Mark stood by the window, watching the sun rise over a city that felt fundamentally different. The weight of the secret was gone, replaced by the heavy responsibility of the aftermath. "What happens now?" Julia asked, standing beside him. "Now, the lawyers take over," Mark said, his voice tired. "But the money, the pension funds, they've already started the process of returning them. The accounts were frozen just in time." Thomas walked over, a stack of papers in his hand. "I've been talking to the publishers, Mark. They don't want a mystery novel anymore. They want the true story, the one we lived." "Are you going to write it?" Mark asked. Thomas shook his head and handed the papers to Mark. "No. I've done my part. This story belongs to the man who wouldn't let the desk stay empty. You write it, Mark. Tell them everything. Tell them about Elena. Tell them about the fire." Mark looked at the first page. It was a blank sheet of paper, save for one line at the top. "For the people of Stonebridge." 2 weeks later, Mark drove his blue car across the old stone bridge and into the heart of Stonebridge. The village was different. The welcome sign had been repainted, and the air didn't feel quite so heavy with the scent of stagnant water. The Stonebridge Inn was under new management, a collective of former mill workers who had used a portion of their returned pension funds to buy the building. Mr. Henderson was awaiting trial, but the inn was full of life. Mark saw people sitting on the porch, talking openly, the wall of silence a memory of a darker time. He drove to the ruins of the mill. It was no longer a place of ghosts. The The village had voted to turn the site into a memorial park. The charred stones were being cleaned, and a garden was being planted where the hidden basement once stood. He found Arthur Vance sitting on a bench near the river. He was a free man, though his eyes still carried the weight of the years. The charges against him had been reduced to time served, thanks to Mark's testimony about his role in stopping Reed on the roof. "It's a good day for a walk, Arthur," Mark said, sitting beside him. "It is," Vance said, watching the water rush over the rocks. "The river sounds different when you're not trying to hide a secret in it." "Are you staying?" "I think so," Vance replied. "I have a lot of flowers to plant. Elena would have liked the garden." Mark left him there and walked up the hill to Thomas Gray's house. Thomas and Julia were in the garden, drinking tea. The house was no longer a fortress of shadows. The curtains were open, and the sound of a typewriter drifted through the window. "Is it finished?" Julia asked, smiling as Mark approached. Mark reached into his bag and pulled out a thick manuscript. "The final draft. It's all in there. From the first day I walked into the inn to the moment the council fell." He set the manuscript on the garden table. He felt a profound sense of lightness. The investigation was over. The truth was out. The people of Stonebridge were no longer victims. They were survivors. Mark Thorne sat at his desk in the city. The office was quiet, the frantic energy of the Aegis scandal having settled into the slow grind of the judicial system. His desk was no longer empty. It was covered in letters from people across the country, workers from other small towns, children of mill workers, people who had found hope in the story of Stonebridge. He looked at the morning edition of the Daily Chronicle. Julian Sterling had been forced to resign, and the paper was now under new, independent ownership. The headline read, "Stonebridge, the justice reclaimed." Mark picked up a small, silver key from his desk, the one he had found in the hollowed-out book. He turned it over in his hand, feeling the weight of it. It was a reminder that even the smallest key can open the heaviest door if someone is brave enough to turn it. He thought about Thomas and Julia, living their lives in the light. He thought about Arthur Vance, finding peace in his garden. And he thought about the empty desk that had started it all. He reached for a new sheet of paper and rolled it into his typewriter. He didn't have a mystery to solve or a criminal to hunt. He just had a blank page and a story to tell. He typed the final words of his journey, a reflection on what he had learned. "The truth is not a destination," he typed. "It is a constant, difficult path. It requires us to look into the dark when it is easier to close our eyes. It requires us to speak when the world demands silence. But in the end, the truth is the only thing that sets us free." He pulled the page from the typewriter and set it on top of the stack. He stood up, grabbed his coat, and walked toward the door. As he turned off the office lights, the sun caught the surface of his desk. It was clean, it was ready, and for the first time in his life, it was exactly what it needed to be. Mark Thorne walked out into the city, no longer a man chasing ghosts, but a man who had brought them home.